When someone vanishes without a trace, we naturally assume the worst. We search, we grieve, and eventually, we move on. But what happens when a ghost walks right back through the front door? Today, we're covering the 10 most disturbing cases of people who disappeared off the face of the earth only to shockingly reappear years later. If you enjoyed deep dives into the unexplained, please hit that subscribe button and give hype points. Now, let's get into it. Imagine you're a police officer in Dusseldorf, Germany. It's September 2015. You get called out to a routine burglary, nothing dramatic. Someone broke into an apartment, the resident called it in, you show up to take a statement, standard paperwork. You ask the woman living there for her ID, the way you'd ask anyone. And she just freezes. No wallet, no passport, no driver's license, nothing. She says her name is Mrs. Schneider, but she can't prove it. She can't prove anything. And then, after a long, uncomfortable silence, this quiet, middle-aged woman looks at you and says 7 words that break your entire afternoon. I am Petra Pasitka, a name you've never heard of. A name that, back at the station, will make one of the older detectives go pale, because Petra Pasitka has been dead for 26 years, officially, on paper, with a death certificate and a killer's confession and a grieving family. And she's standing right in front of you drinking a glass of water. This is the story of how a 24-year-old computer science student erased herself so completely that a convicted murderer took credit for killing her. And she let him. Let me take you back. It's July 26, 1984. West Germany. Braunschweig, a historic old university town about an hour east of Hanover. It's the tail end of the summer semester. Students are packing up. The air smells like linden trees and cigarette smoke. This is peak analog Europe. No cell phones, no internet, no CCTV on every corner. Banks close at 4 p.m. If you want to find someone, you use a phone book. If you want to disappear, well, we'll get to that. Petra Pasitka is 24 years old. She's a computer science student, which in 1984 basically makes her a rare species. She's brilliant, meticulous. She's grinding away at a 100-page diploma thesis on programming language quirks, the kind of thing that would put you and me into a coma, but she loves it. She lives in a student dorm. She has a pet bird. Her parents live in Wolfsburg, about 30 minutes away, and they're heading off on vacation. So Petra's supposed to travel over there and babysit her younger brother Karsten for a bit while she finishes her paper. Here's what you need to understand about Petra. There's no drama here. There's no abusive boyfriend, no secret pregnancy, no cult, no debt, no depression on record. Decades later, when she finally gets asked directly, she flat out denies any abuse, any trauma, anything at all that would push a young woman to torch her entire life. She's the daughter every parent dreams of. Straight A student, reliable, on track for a good career at a time when a computer science degree was basically a ticket to the middle class. So on the morning of July 26th, she does something completely normal. She hands her apartment keys to a neighbor and asks him, casually, no big deal, to feed her bird while she's over in Wolfsburg. Feed the bird. Remember that detail. Feed the bird. That afternoon, Petra runs errands, ordinary ones. She walks into a shop to buy a typewriter ribbon, a birthday gift for her brother Karsten. The shop is out of stock. The clerk politely offers to order one in for her. She politely declines. She'll figure something else out. Then she goes to the dentist. 2 fillings. She sits in the chair, the drill whines, she pays her bill, and on the way out, she books a follow-up appointment. 2 weeks from now. See you then. Then she walks toward the bus stop, presumably to catch a bus to her parents' place in Wolfsburg. And that's it. That's the last time anyone sees Petra Pasitka. She never gets on the bus. She never arrives in Wolfsburg. She doesn't come back for her follow-up filling. She doesn't come back for her bird. The next day, her brother Karsten files a missing persons report, and West Germany does what West Germany does. It mobilizes, bureaucratically, thoroughly. Police search the flat. They interview the dentist, the shopkeeper, the neighbor. Nothing. No signs of struggle, no blood, no note, no boyfriend nobody knew about. She just evaporated. By January 1985, the case is such a black hole that they put it on Aktenzeichen XY ungelöst. If you're not German, think of it as the original Unsolved Mysteries, a nationally televised true crime show where they'd reenact cases with actors and beg the public for tips. Petra's face goes out to millions of homes. The tip line lights up. Sightings pour in. All of them, every single one, lead nowhere. Then, in March of that same year, the case seems to crack open. A 19-year-old carpenter's apprentice named Günther K. gets arrested nearby for the tragic murder of a 14-year-old girl. It's a horrific case in its own right. And during interrogation, over months of police pressure, Günther K. gives them a bonus. He confesses to killing Petra Pasitka too. He says he did it. He doesn't produce a body. He doesn't produce evidence. He just says the words, and later he takes it back. He recants. But by then, the machinery is already turning. Police have their man. Case looks closed. And in 1989, 5 years after Petra walked out of that dentist's office, her parents give up hope. They go to a German court and have their daughter legally declared dead. Officially. On paper. Petra Pasitka. Deceased. Presumed murder victim. The family holds a private grief. Karsten grows up with a ghost sister. Her mother, Brigitte, carries that specific weight only mothers of murdered daughters carry. And then, silence. For 26 more years. Until September 11th, 2015. A quiet apartment in Düsseldorf, a routine burglary call, and a woman named Mrs. Schneider, who can't produce a single piece of ID, quietly telling a stunned police officer, "I am Petra Pasitka." She's 55 years old. Her teeth are visibly rotting. She wants no contact with her family. She wants no interviews, no cameras, no explanation. She just wants to be left alone. But the paperwork now has her name on it, and the paperwork does not lie. Okay, hold on a second. Let's break down why this makes absolutely zero sense. Let's start with the confession. In 1987, Günther K., a man already convicted of raping and murdering a teenager, sits across from detectives and tells them he also killed Petra Pasitka. Why? Why would you do that? Think about it. He's already going away for a long time. Confessing to a second murder doesn't reduce his sentence. It doesn't help him. There are really only two possibilities here, and both of them are ugly. Option 1, the police, under enormous pressure to close a nationally televised case, leaned on him until he agreed. Option 2, he did it voluntarily for the fame. Because in the twisted logic of a violent offender, taking credit for a famous unsolved case makes you notorious. It makes you the guy. He was already a monster, might as well be a bigger one. Either way, think about what this does. It gives Petra the perfect cover. A convicted killer confesses. The police close the file. The family buries their grief. Nobody is looking for her anymore. Nobody. And she knew that. She had to know that. Now let's talk about the ghost life. And this is the part that I genuinely cannot get my head around. Germany. Modern Germany. West Germany. Then reunified Germany. This is the country that invented paperwork. If you move apartments in Germany, you have 14 days to register your new address with the state or you get fined. It's called the Meldegesetz. Every landlord needs to see your ID. Every bank needs your papers. Every job, even part-time, wants documentation. Every doctor, every dentist, every gym membership. Petra lived there for 31 years, 31, with no ID card, no driver's license, no health insurance, no social security number, no bank account, no tax records, no cell phone contract, nothing. How? Well, here's what we know. She rented under the fake name Mrs. Schneider and paid every bill in physical cash. She worked odd jobs under the table, the kind of jobs where nobody asks questions and nobody files a W-2. And she collected Pfand, those little deposit refunds you get for returning glass bottles and cans in Germany. She literally scavenged bottles off the street to make ends meet. A neighbor once knocked on her door to ask for the Wi-Fi password and got a look inside. Barely any furniture, and her teeth were falling out. Which, if you remember, is a sick little irony. Her last confirmed act as a citizen of the world in 1984 was going to the dentist. And then for 31 years, She never went back to one. And here's the thing about Petra that everyone tends to skip past. She didn't just wander off in a fugue state. This was planned, cold-bloodedly planned. Look at her actions that day again. She withdrew 4,000 Deutsche Marks in secret savings. That's real money in 1984, enough to disappear on. She had already pre-rented an apartment in Gelsenkirchen, hours away. She left her bird with the neighbor, because a girl who's disappearing forever doesn't leave her bird alone in an apartment to starve. That would trigger alarm. That would trigger a wellness check. She went to the dentist and booked a follow-up appointment she never intended to keep. She shopped for her brother's birthday gift she never intended to give. Every single action that day was designed to make it look like she was coming back, to buy her time, to make the trail go cold before anyone realized she was gone. This wasn't a woman in crisis. This was a computer science student, someone whose brain was literally trained to think in systems and logic, engineering her own exit from society. And she pulled it off so well that a convicted killer walked into a police interview room and handed her the perfect ending, a fake death that let her walk away clean. So what actually happened to Petra Pasitka? Nothing. That's the answer. Nothing happened to her. She was not kidnapped. She was not murdered. She was not trafficked or coerced or brainwashed. No crime was ever committed against her. She just decided one Thursday afternoon in July 1984 that she didn't want to be Petra Pasitka anymore, and she walked away. And here's the wildest part. Under German law, that's not actually illegal. Faking your own death on its own isn't a crime. It only becomes a crime if you use it to defraud someone, an insurance company, the government, a spouse. Petra never touched a cent of insurance money. She never claimed a benefit. She never filed a fraudulent tax return. She was so disciplined, so committed to being a ghost, that when they finally caught her in 2015, all they could hit her with was a fine of up to 500 euros for violating the residential registration law. 500 euros for 31 years of not existing. When her mother and brother found out she was alive, they wrote her a letter, an emotional, open-hearted letter, begging her to come home. Come back. We forgave you before we even knew there was anything to forgive. Please. She said no. She would not see them. She would not explain herself. To this day, no one, not her family, not the police, not a single journalist, has been given a real answer about why. What was so unbearable about a promising academic career and a loving family that she'd rather scavenge bottles off the street for 3 decades than say a single word to her own mother? We don't know. We may never know. But think about this before you close the tab. Every year for 31 years, her mother lit a candle for a murdered daughter. Every year, Karsten thought about the sister he lost. They mourned a body that was never there. And the whole time, Petra was alive, sitting in a small apartment 2 hours down the Autobahn, watching her own name fade out of the newspapers. She wasn't hiding from a killer. She wasn't running from a monster. She was hiding from us, from all of it, from being known. And the truly haunting thing? If that burglar had just picked a different apartment that day in September 2015, she'd still be Mrs. Schneider, and Petra Pasitka would still be dead. Imagine you're 14 years old. You're walking through the hallways of your high school in Cape Town on your very first day of freshman year. You're nervous. You're trying to remember your locker combination. And then you notice something weird. People keep stopping you in the corridors. Older kids, teachers, random strangers. They're all giving you this strange, confused look. And they all say the same thing. You look exactly like Mishe. Mishe who? Mishe Solomon. A senior, a girl you've never met in your life. But the resemblance is so uncanny, so unsettling, that it starts to feel like an inside joke you're not in on. Eventually you meet her, and when you stand next to her, it's not just a resemblance. It's like looking at your own face in a slightly older mirror. You take a selfie, you show it to your dad, and your dad looks at that photo and his hands start to shake, because he's been searching for a face that looks exactly like yours for 17 years. This is the story of Zephany Nurse and the reason a Cape Town family solved a 17-year kidnapping case using a teenage girl's cell phone. Let me set the scene. April 1997, Cape Town, South Africa. This is a country that is only 3 years into the post-apartheid era. Everything is in transition, everything is changing. And inside a big, busy public hospital called Groote Schuur, the same hospital where Christian Barnard performed the world's first heart transplant back in the 60s, a young woman named Celeste Nurse has just had a baby. Celeste is 18 years old. This is her first child, and it hasn't been easy. She's just had a C-section, which anyone who's been through one will tell you is major abdominal surgery. She's stitched up, she's sore, she's pumped full of painkillers, and she's exhausted in the specific bone-deep way that only new mothers understand. But she's also over the moon. Because on April 28, 1997, she gives birth to a healthy baby girl. They name her Zephany. It's an unusual name, a special name. Celeste's husband, Morn Nurse, is beside himself. They've been talking about this baby for months. They've picked out the outfits. They've imagined the birthdays. Their whole future is now this tiny, warm, 3-day-old bundle sleeping in a bassinet next to Celeste's hospital bed. Now, here's what you need to understand about a maternity ward in 1997. There's no biometric scanning. There are no smart wristbands that trigger alarms if you cross a threshold. Security is basically a locked door and a nurse's station, and the assumption, the good, decent human assumption, that anyone walking around in scrubs is a nurse. And that assumption is about to cost this family 17 years. Here's what we know. On the day before Zephany is taken, something strange happens on the same ward. A woman in a nurse's uniform tries to pick up a different baby. That baby's mother, a woman named Shireen Piet, is awake, sharp, and immediately suspicious. She confronts the nurse. The woman mumbles something and leaves. Shireen mentions it. Nobody puts it together, because in a busy hospital, mix-ups happen. Somebody probably just walked into the wrong room, right? Wrong. That was a dry run. The next morning, April 30th, Celeste is drifting in and out of sleep. The painkillers are heavy. Through the fog, she sees a woman in a nurse's uniform, maroon pants, an oatmeal-colored top, leaning over her bassinet, gently comforting Zephany, who's fussing a little. Celeste thinks, oh good, the nurse has got her, and she lets herself sink back into sleep. Because why wouldn't she? This is a hospital. This is a nurse. When she wakes up, the bassinet is empty. At first she thinks the baby's been taken for a checkup. It takes minutes, precious, irreplaceable minutes, for the panic to set in. She calls a real nurse. The real nurse doesn't know anything about a checkup. Suddenly the whole floor's running. The hospital goes into lockdown. Doctors, security, everybody. They find a discarded baby nest, a garment, a handbag with all the identifying labels scrubbed off, but no Zephany and no woman in maroon pants. Morn, the father, gets the call at work. By the time he arrives at Groote Schuur, he cannot even stand. Hospital staff find him crumpled on the floor near the elevators, sobbing. Because he knows, every parent knows, the window for finding a missing infant is measured in hours, and those hours are already gone. The case explodes across South Africa. This is a national story. And then the years start. 1 birthday, 2 birthdays, 5, 10. The nurse family does something extraordinary. They refuse to let Zephany become a ghost. Every single year on April 28th, they hold a birthday party. In the media, in the newspapers, on television, balloons, a cake, an empty chair. They plead with whoever has her. They tell her if she's watching somewhere, that they love her, that they're waiting. Every year, for 17 years, nothing. Then, in January 2015, a girl named Cassidy Nurse, Zephany's biological younger sister born after the kidnapping, starts her freshman year at a high school called Zwanswyk. And within days, people are stopping her in the hallways to tell her she looks exactly like a senior named Michelle Solomon. Cassidy meets Michelle. They click instantly. There's this weird, unspoken magnetism. They start hanging out. They take a selfie together on a phone. Cassidy shows the photo to her dad, Morn, kind of laughing about it. Dad, everyone says this girl looks like me. Morn stares at the photo, and Morn is not laughing. He does what any obsessed, grieving father who has spent 17 years looking at age progression sketches would do. He goes on Facebook. He finds Michelle Solomon's profile. He compares faces, he notes birthdays, he does the math backwards, and then he goes to the Hawks, that's South Africa's elite investigation unit, and he says, "I think I've found my daughter." They arrange a coffee meeting. Morn, pretending to just be a friendly guy meeting his kid's classmate, has coffee with Michelle. He talks to her. He memorizes her features. He gathers whatever details he can. He walks away, and he tells the police, "Test her." A DNA sample is taken. February 25, 2015. The results come back, 99.9%. Michelle Solomon is Zephany Nurse. Okay, hold on. Let's break this down, because there's so much here that shouldn't be logically possible. Start with the kidnapper. Her name is Lavona Solomon, and she lived, this whole time, just a few miles away from the Nurse family in a Cape Town suburb called Retreat. Not another city, not another country. A short drive away. Here's her story. In late 1996, Lavona suffered a miscarriage, but she never told her husband, Michael. Instead, and I want you to really sit with this, she faked the rest of the pregnancy for months. She kept wearing maternity clothes. She kept talking about the baby. She kept going to doctor's appointments that didn't exist. And then, on the day she stole Zephany from Groot Schuur, she walked out of that hospital, went home, and presented a 3-day-old stolen infant to her husband as their newborn daughter. And he believed her. Now let's talk about how she pulled off the actual abduction. She used the hospital's underground service tunnels to bypass the main entrance. She wore stolen scrubs, maroon pants, and an oatmeal top. She had already scouted the maternity ward the day before with the failed attempt on Shireen Piet's baby. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment grab. This was a plan. A cold, methodical plan by a woman drowning in her own grief who decided to steal someone else's joy to fix it. And then she went home and raised Zephany as Michelle for 18 years, fake birth records, registered in Malmesbury in 2003 as her biological child, signed up for school, went to soccer games, bought birthday cakes, everything a mother does, and her husband, Michael, apparently never suspected a thing. But now let's talk about the coincidence that actually cracked this case, because this is where I have to stop and just breathe for a second. Cape Town is a city of nearly 5 million people. There are dozens and dozens of high schools, public schools, private schools, religious schools, technical schools. When Cassidy Nurse turned 14 years old, she could have gone to any of them. But she went to Zwanswyk. And out of every high school in Cape Town, Zwanswyk was the exact school where Michelle Solomon, the girl who was actually her biological sister, was already a senior. Not just enrolled at the same school. Enrolled at the same school at the same time, with only a 4-year age gap that put them in overlapping years. Close enough that they'd actually meet, close enough that they'd talk, close enough that they'd become friends. Now, factor in the smartphone. Because this discovery doesn't happen without a phone camera. In 1997, if these two girls had met, Morn might have seen his kid's new friend eventually at a school pickup from a distance. Would that have been enough? Would he have connected the dots? Maybe not. But because of a casual teenage selfie, a high-resolution image of Michelle's face got beamed directly into a grieving father's hands. The Hawks didn't crack this case. The FBI-level detectives didn't crack this case. Facial recognition software didn't crack this case. A 14-year-old girl and an iPhone cracked this case. And here's the part that really messes with me. The most emotionally devastating twist of the entire story. When the DNA results come back and confirm that Michelle is Zephany, everyone expects a fairy tale ending, tearful reunion, long-lost daughter runs into her real mother's arms, roll credits. That's not what happened. Michelle was destroyed by the news, absolutely destroyed. Because think about it from her perspective. She was 17 years old, she had a mother, she had a father, she had a brother, she had a bedroom, a life, a childhood, birthday photos, memories. And now the police were telling her that all of it, every single piece of it, was a lie. That her mother was actually a kidnapper. That her real family were these strangers who had been throwing sad birthday parties on the news. At their first meeting at the Belleville police station, she hugged Celeste and Morn. But she said later it was out of politeness, not love. She was furious. She was grieving. And, in one of the most psychologically difficult decisions any teenager has ever had to make, she publicly defended the woman who kidnapped her. She refused to call Livona a monster. She said Livona was her mother. She kept the name Miche. She kept calling Michael Solomon her dad, because to her, in every way that a child understands the word, she was their kid. Livona Solomon went to trial in 2016. She tried this bizarre defense where she claimed a mysterious woman named Sylvia had handed her the baby at a train station. Nobody bought it. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison for kidnapping, fraud, and violating the Children's Act. Michael Solomon, the husband, was never charged. To this day, the official position is that he was as much a victim of the deception as anyone. And Miche? She's now an adult. She's a mother herself with 2 children of her own. She's tried slowly and painfully to build a relationship with the nurse family. It hasn't been easy. There's love there. But there's also this canyon of missing time that no amount of Sunday dinners can fill. She's written a book. She's told her story. And she's chosen to keep living as Miche Solomon. Because that's who she is. That's who she was raised to be. And here's the final thing I want you to sit with. Somewhere in Cape Town right now, Celeste Nurse is a mother who spent 17 years mourning a baby she never got to raise, only to find her daughter grown up, formed, finished, and calling another woman mom. Every choice, every laugh, every first day of school, every skinned knee, every teenage argument. Livona got all of it. Celeste got the DNA test, and Miche, Zephany, is stuck in the middle. 2 names, 2 families, 2 entirely different origin stories for the exact same life. And no version of this ends cleanly. There's no happy reunion. There's no closing the case. There's just this quiet, ongoing negotiation between a stolen childhood and a lived one. If Cassidy Nurse had picked any other high school in Cape Town, we wouldn't be talking about this. Miche would still be Miche. Livona would still be free. And every April 28th, the Nurse family would still be holding a birthday party for a daughter they'd never meet. 1 selfie. That's what it took. 1 selfie and a dad who never stopped looking. Imagine you're deep in the woods of central Italy. It's a cold, damp morning in November 2015. It rained hard the whole weekend, and everything smells like wet leaves and mushrooms. You and a buddy are hunting for porcini. That's the whole trip. You wander off the marked trails because that's where the good mushrooms are. You push through some brambles, and that's when you see it. Garbage. A trail of it. Empty plastic bottles, scraps of tarp, ripped cans. You follow the trail like breadcrumbs. It leads you to a clearing. And in that clearing, there's a shelter. Just a filthy blue tarp strung up between 2 trees. Plastic jerry cans catching rainwater, a dead campfire. And then the flap of the tarp moves, and a man steps out. Wild beard down to his chest, skin caked in dirt, eyes that haven't seen a mirror in a very long time. You freeze. You're ready to run. But he looks at you, calm as anything, and he says, in perfect Spanish, "Soy español. My name is Carlos. I've been living here since 1997. Then he ducks back into his tent, and he comes out holding, of all things, a battered old passport and a university library card. This is the story of a Spanish doctor who spent nearly 20 years hiding from the human race in a Tuscan forest, and the moment he was found, he vanished again. Let me take you back. Mid-1990s. Seville, Spain. If you've never been, Seville is one of the most electric cities in Europe. Orange trees lining the streets, flamenco spilling out of tapas bars at midnight. The sun hits everything like it's personally offended by shade. Tourists, students, families, professionals. The city hums. It never really sleeps. And in the middle of all of that noise and heat and life, there's a man named Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar. He's a medical doctor, highly educated, well-respected, originally from Bilbao up in the Basque country, but building his career in the south, the kind of guy your parents would kill for you to marry. On paper, Carlos has everything, a profession that carries prestige, a future. But behind the front door of his home in Seville, Carlos is drowning. He's suffering from severe clinical depression, not a bad week, not some job stress. We're talking about the paralyzing, crushing, chemical kind, the kind that turns getting out of bed into climbing a mountain. And here's the tragic irony. Carlos is a doctor. He knows exactly what's happening to him. He knows the vocabulary. He could probably diagnose himself in his sleep. But knowing what depression is and being able to fight it are two completely different things. There's no scandal here, no malpractice suit, no affair, no crime, no debt, just a brilliant man being slowly hollowed out from the inside by his own brain. And in 1996, that hollowing out reaches a breaking point. He walks out of his house one day, no note, no goodbye, no dramatic scene. He just leaves. And the Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar that his family knew, the doctor, the son, the citizen, disappears from the face of the earth. The Spanish authorities do what authorities do. They open a file, they ask around, they knock on doors. But they've got nothing to go on. There's no ransom note, no witnesses, no crime scene. There's no boyfriend to interrogate, no boss to question. Carlos didn't fight with anyone. He didn't rack up gambling debts. He just walked out of his life like he was going out for cigarettes and never came back. The trail doesn't just go cold. It doesn't exist to begin with. Years pass. His parents, especially his mother Amelia, agonize. Every phone call could be the phone call. Every knock on the door could be that knock. They live in that specific kind of limbo that families of missing people know too well, where you can't grieve because you don't have a body and you can't hope because you don't have a lid. 5 years, 10 years, 14 years, nothing. Finally, in 2010, 14 years after Carlos walked out that door, Spanish courts formally declare him legally dead. This isn't cruelty on his family's part. It's paperwork catching up with reality. Legally, they have to move on. Insurance, assets, records. So a piece of paper is signed, and Dr. Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar officially becomes a ghost in the Spanish system. But here's the twist. The ghost is very much alive, just not in Spain. Somewhere between 1996 and 1997, Carlos crossed borders. We don't know how. We don't know what he was carrying. What we know is that he ended up in central Italy, in the Maremma region of southern Tuscany. And he didn't head to Florence or Rome or Siena. He walked into the woods outside a small town called Scarlino. And he decided, apparently on the spot, that these woods were now his home. For the next 19 years, he lived there. Just lived there. Under a tarp, drinking rainwater, scavenging for food. And then, on a rainy weekend in November 2015, 2 mushroom foragers went off the trail. They followed the garbage. They found the camp. And they found him. Bearded, dirty, calm. He introduced himself. He explained in that quiet, matter-of-fact way that he was a Spanish doctor, and he'd been living there since 1997 because he did not want to be among people. And when the foragers looked skeptical, because, come on, you would too, he ducked back into his shelter and returned with proof. A long-expired Spanish passport with his face on it, a university library card. They took photos with their phones. They promised to leave him alone. They walked out of the woods and immediately contacted Penelope, an Italian missing persons organization, who called their Spanish partners at SOS Desaparecidos, who called Carlos's family. Carlos's elderly parents, a mother and father who had buried him legally, if not literally, got the call of a lifetime. Their son, alive, in Italy, in a forest. They booked flights. Okay, hold on. Let's break down why almost nothing about this story makes rational sense. Start with the survival, because I want you to actually picture this for a second. This is not a Discovery Channel host with a knife and a flint and a camera crew waiting off-screen. This is a middle-aged city doctor, a man whose hands were trained to hold a stethoscope, not to skin a rabbit, a man who, for most of his adult life, ate meals someone else prepared, slept in a heated apartment, and would call a plumber if his sink got clogged. And this man survived nearly 20 winters in central Italy, under a plastic tarp. Let's break down the logistics of that. Tuscany is beautiful in the postcards, but the Maremma region gets cold and wet in the winter. There are wild boars in those woods, aggressive, unpredictable, dangerous animals that can gore a grown man. There are deer, foxes, snakes. The nights get freezing, the rain is relentless, and Carlos had no wood cabin, no proper stove, no winter gear, no antibiotics. What did he eat? Locals think he foraged, berries, roots, whatever he could pull off a tree. But that's not enough to survive. Locals also speculated, and this is grim, that he probably raided garbage cans in nearby villages under the cover of night. A nocturnal scavenger. Because that would explain how he stayed alive, and it would explain how, for 2 decades, virtually nobody saw him. He wasn't going into towns during the day. He was ghosting through them at 3 a.m., picking through what people had thrown out. And what happens if you get sick out there? What happens if you break your ankle, get bitten by something, cut yourself and it goes septic? He was a doctor, so he knew exactly what could kill him. But he had no medicine, no antiseptic, no help. If he'd gone down out there with an infection, no one would have found him for years, maybe decades, maybe ever. Now, here's the paradox that really gets me. If you truly want to disappear, I mean truly, completely erase yourself, what's the first thing you burn? Your passport, right? Come on, that little book with your face and your name in it, that is your identity in physical form. If you're committed to being a ghost, that thing goes in the campfire on day 1. You watch it burn. You feel free. Carlos didn't. Carlos kept his passport for 20 years, in a plastic tent, in the rain, in the mud. He kept it dry enough that when 2 random Italian mushroom hunters walked into his clearing, he could pull it out and hand it over to prove who he was. Think about what that means. Some part of Carlos, some deep buried part, never fully let go. He built a whole life on the idea of not being Dr. Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar anymore, but he carried the last piece of that man around with him like a talisman for 2 decades. That's not the behavior of someone who wanted to die. That's the behavior of someone who was trying to survive his own mind. And why show it to the foragers at all? He could have lied. He could have said, "I'm nobody, please leave." He could have said his name was Marco. But no, when they seemed confused, he actively went and got the passport and let them photograph it. In some strange way, on some level, he wanted the world to know he was still alive, just from a safe distance. Which brings us to the most heartbreaking part of the entire story. Carlos knew what would happen next. He was a smart man. The moment he showed those foragers his passport, he understood exactly what was coming. Phone calls, authorities, missing persons databases, his mother, his family, a search party. So the moment those hikers left the clearing, he moved. By the time the mayor of Scarlino organized a search team, by the time Carlos's 65-year-old mother Amelia and the rest of his family flew from Spain to Italy, by the time they hiked into the woods to that GPS coordinate the foragers had pinned, the clearing was empty, the tarp was gone, the camp was dismantled. All that was left was some disturbed earth and a few empty water canisters. He had ghosted again, deeper into the woods, deeper into the silence. His mother stood in that empty clearing. She stood where her son had been standing days before. She had crossed a country to get there. She was so close, she could almost smell the smoke from his campfire, and there was nothing left of him but trash. So what really happened to Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar? Nothing was done to him. That's the terrifying answer. Nobody hurt him. No one kidnapped him. No cartel, no crime, no accident. Carlos wasn't running from a person. He was running from his own mind. His depression was so deep, so relentless, that it drove a highly trained medical professional to abandon everything: career, family, country, comfort, safety, and voluntarily live like a hunted animal for 2 decades. Because for him, apparently, being alone in the mud was less painful than being surrounded by people in a warm apartment. That's the thing about depression that people who've never really had it don't understand. It's not sadness. Sadness is a normal human response. Depression is a hijacker. It rewires you. It makes cold, wet, dangerous solitude feel like peace. Carlos didn't run into the woods to end his life. He ran into the woods to make it bearable. His mother, Amelia, stood in front of the Italian press with a grace that I honestly cannot imagine having in that moment. She didn't rage. She didn't beg the police to launch a manhunt. She said, essentially, okay, her son was alive. That was the thing that mattered. She said the family would respect his freedom and his wishes. But they weren't going home. Not without seeing him first, not without a hug, even just for a few moments. She never got the hug, because as far as we know, no one has seen Carlos since. He's been searched for. He's been talked about. He's got a nickname now in that part of Italy, the Hermit of the Scarlino Woods. But nobody has caught him. Nobody has photographed him. Nobody has heard him speak again. He's still out there. Somewhere in the trees of Tuscany, a Spanish doctor is entering his 60s, maybe his 70s. His parents are aging, and he knows it. He knows they've been looking for him. He knows he has a home to come back to. He knows that all of it is just one phone call away. And every day he chooses over and over to stay in the forest. Because for Carlos, the forest is the medicine, and the world you and I live in is the disease. Somewhere, right now, he's building a small fire, boiling rainwater, watching the branches move in the wind. And you and I will probably never hear from him again. Imagine you're a guy in Ohio, sitting at your kitchen table one afternoon in 2013. You've got a laptop open, you're on Ancestry.com, and you're building out your family tree the way people do, filling in aunts and uncles, tracing your last name back through the generations. You get to your Uncle Terry Szymanski, nice guy, commercial fisherman down in Florida, died in a tragic accident at sea back in 1991. You were a kid at the time. You still remember the funeral. You type his name in, and the algorithm starts throwing back records. A birth certificate, a death certificate, normal stuff. But then, weird stuff. A Florida driver's license issued to Terry Szymanski in 1994. A marriage license issued to Terry Szymanski in 1995. A pilot's license. Property records. All under Terry's name. All dated after your uncle's funeral. You sit there staring at the screen. Because there's only one explanation that makes any sense. Someone has been walking around wearing your dead uncle for over 20 years. This is the story of Richard Hoagland, the Indiana insurance salesman who told his wife he was going to the emergency room and instead vanished into thin air to go steal a dead man's name, marry a new woman, have a new son, and start a whole second life 900 miles away, and how he got caught by a hobby genealogy website. Let me take you back. February 1993. Fishers, Indiana, just outside Indianapolis. This is peak Midwestern suburbia. Freezing cold, wind cutting sideways off the flat farmland, driveways white with rock salt. Everyone's furnace is cranked. The Colts are terrible. Bill Clinton has just been sworn in. Life is normal. And in a nice 5-bedroom house in this quiet suburb lives the Hoagland family. Richard, the dad, Linda Eisler, the mom, and 2 little boys, Matthew, who's 9, and Doug, who's 6. From every possible angle, this family is the picture of the American dream. Big house, speedboat parked in the driveway, 2 kids, 2-car garage. Dad has a good job as an insurance salesman. Mom keeps the household running, Sunday dinners, birthday parties, family photos on the fridge. And Richard? Richard is a charmer. He's in his early 40s. He's charismatic. He's smooth. He's the guy who can walk into a room and make everyone laugh. Classic salesman energy. The kind of guy neighbors describe as solid. The kind of guy PTA moms trust with their kids' fundraisers. But under that shiny American dream veneer, the house is rotting from the inside. Because Richard has been quietly draining his family financially. Every credit card is maxed out. He's forged Linda's signature on a fraudulent bank loan. And most importantly, law enforcement is starting to sniff around him. There's an active investigation into some theft allegations. The walls are closing in. The clock is ticking. Richard is about to get caught. So on February 10th, 1993, on a freezing Indiana morning, Richard puts on his best worried husband face. He turns to Linda and he tells her he feels awful. Chest pain, maybe, or terrible flu, something bad. He needs to drive himself to the hospital. And Linda, who has no reason on earth to doubt him, watches her husband walk out the front door. She will not see him again for 23 years. Richard's car turns up abandoned at the Indianapolis airport, and immediately Linda's world detonates. Because a man doesn't drive to the ER, park at the airport, and vanish. That's not a heart attack. That's a plan. But at first, nobody knows what kind of plan. Is it kidnapping, a mental break, foul play, a getaway? Then the phone calls start. Richard actually calls Linda. Collect. From Aruba. Then a few days later from Venezuela. He doesn't tell her where he is exactly. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't explain. He just taunts her. Like he's letting her know, I'm alive, I'm free, you're stuck. And then that summer, he mails his 2 little boys, Matthew and Doug, a birthday card with $50 tucked inside. And then, nothing. Complete silence. For 23 years, that birthday card is the last time Richard Hoagland speaks to his own children. Meanwhile, Linda is drowning. Because Richard didn't just leave. He left a scorched earth behind him. Every credit card he'd secretly maxed out, those bills came due. The fraudulent bank loan he'd forged her signature on. That debt was hers now. In the divorce that followed, a judge assigned Linda 26 separate debts that Richard had incurred behind her back. She lost her home. She had to explain to 2 little boys why Daddy wasn't coming to their soccer games anymore. And to make it all worse, the police were suspicious of her. Because that's how it works. When a suburban dad vanishes without a body, the wife is always the first suspect. Detectives grilled Linda, neighbors whispered, everyone was quietly wondering if she'd killed him and buried him somewhere. She lived under that shadow for years. 10 years passed. In 2003, an Indiana court did what Indiana courts do in these cases. They formally declared Richard Hoagland legally dead. His sons stopped waiting for him. Linda tried to rebuild. But Richard was very much alive. Richard was in Florida. Specifically, Richard was in a little town called Zephyr Hills. Sunny, warm, trailer parks and orange trees, and he was living there under a different name. Because sometime in 1994, while his sons were losing their house in Indiana, Richard had rented a room from an elderly widower named Edward Szymanski. Edward's son Terry had died at sea in 1991. And somewhere in that house, Richard found Terry's death certificate. And he took it. From that one stolen piece of paper, Richard built an entire new person. He got Terry's birth certificate, then a driver's license, then property. In 1995, he legally married a woman named Mary Hickman under the name Terry Szymanski. They had a son. Richard got a pilot's license. He bought an airplane. He was living, honest to God, the good life. Beach town, loving wife, baby boy. Flying his own plane on the weekends. And no one, not his new wife, not his new son, not his neighbors, not a single person in Florida, had any idea he was actually a man from Indiana whose first wife had legally buried him. Then, in 2013, a curious nephew in Ohio opened Ancestry.com. The nephew reported his findings. Eventually, tips reached the Pasco County Sheriff's Office in Florida. Detectives investigated. In July 2016, they knocked on Richard's door. They compared his real face to Terry Szymanski's death certificate, and the second Richard understood what was happening, the game was over. 23 years of lies collapsed in a single afternoon. Okay, hold on. Let's break down the sheer audacity of what this man pulled off. Let's start with the identity theft mechanics. Because you and I sit here in 2026 and we assume this kind of thing is impossible. You can't just walk into a government office and become someone else. There are databases, there's biometric verification, there's cross-referencing between states and federal agencies. Right? Well, welcome to the early 1990s. In 1994, Richard basically walked through the American identity system like it was made of tissue paper. Here's how simple it was. He had Terry's death certificate. He mailed a copy of it to the state of Ohio and used it to request a certified copy of Terry's birth certificate. Ohio had no idea Terry was dead. Their birth records office and Florida's death records office were effectively two completely separate universes that never talked to each other, so they just mailed him back Terry's birth certificate in an envelope, no questions asked. Then he took that birth certificate and walked into an Alabama DMV and used it to get an Alabama driver's license under Terry's name. Different state again. Another silo. Nobody was going to phone Florida and go, "Hey, is your dead guy driving in Alabama now?" Then he took his shiny new Alabama driver's license, walked into a Florida DMV, and traded it for a Florida license. Now he was officially, legally, in every database that mattered, Terry Jude Szymanski. Total elapsed time, probably a few weeks. Total resources required. Envelopes, stamps, and postage. That's it. That's how thin the fabric of American identity was in 1994. One piece of paper stolen from a grieving old man was enough to erase Richard Hoagland and resurrect Terry Szymanski. Post 9/11, this exact playbook mostly stopped working. Databases got linked, real ID standards came in, states started talking to each other. But in 1994, Richard was operating in the golden age of low-tech identity theft. And he knew it. That's what makes this so chilling. He didn't get lucky. He saw the gap and drove a truck through it. But now let's talk about the psychological piece, because this is where I have to stop and just breathe for a second. This is a man who tucked his 2 little boys into bed on the night of February 9th, 1993. Read them a bedtime story, maybe. Kissed them goodnight. And then the next morning, he told his wife he was sick and just never came back. Ever. He heard somehow that his family was losing their house. He knew his wife was being interrogated by detectives who suspected her of murder. He knew his sons were growing up without a father. And he did nothing. Meanwhile, he was going to Little League games in Florida with his other son, coaching probably, grilling in the backyard, taking family photos, building baby books, doing all the dad things, just for a different family, in a different state, under a dead man's name. Pasco County Sheriff, when they finally caught him, described Richard perfectly. He called him a selfish coward, somebody whose entire life had been about destroying other people to make himself comfortable. And you look at the facts, and honestly, you cannot argue with that. This wasn't a man who cracked under pressure. This was a man who calmly, methodically, over 23 years, built his happiness directly on top of his first family's suffering. And he slept fine every single night. But now let's talk about the ultimate cruelty of this whole thing. Because when the Pasco County Sheriff's deputies knocked on that door in Zephyrhills, they didn't just end Richard's fake life. They detonated Mary Hickman's real one, and her sons, because Mary had married Terry Szymanski in 1995. She'd loved Terry Szymanski for 21 years. She'd had a baby with Terry Szymanski. She'd shared a bed with Terry Szymanski, made him dinner, done his laundry, planned their retirement. None of that existed. Terry Szymanski had died at sea before she ever met him. Everything she thought she'd built was, in her own words later, a total fiction. Her wedding vows were fraud. Her marriage certificate had a dead man's name on it. Her son's father wasn't who her son had thought he was for his entire childhood. There was no real answer to give her boy at the dinner table that night about what Daddy's real name was, because Daddy's real name belonged to a man in Indiana who had 2 other sons who had been mourning him since 1993. Richard did the impossible. He destroyed 2 families with one lie. And here's the part that will really mess with you. Here's the punchline of this entire story. Richard Hoagland was arrested, prosecuted, sentenced to federal prison in 2017. But, and stay with me here, he was not arrested for abandoning his family. He was not arrested for hiding money. He was not arrested for letting his wife get suspected of murdering him. He was not arrested for lying to his own children. Because in the United States of America, none of that is illegal. It is not a crime to walk out of your life. It's not a crime to abandon your kids emotionally. It's not a crime to let your wife believe you're dead. As long as you don't collect life insurance on yourself, or file fake tax returns, or defraud someone else along the way, you can legally just vanish. That's the terrifying loophole at the center of this whole case. The system doesn't care if you shatter people's souls. It only cares if you break its paperwork rules. Richard broke a paperwork rule. He stole Terry Szymanski's identity, and that is what put him behind bars. Not the 23 years of psychological warfare he waged on his own children. That was free. When he got out of federal prison in 2018, Linda Eisler was waiting. She'd spent 23 years having a bankruptcy court, and Indiana law enforcement blame her for her husband's disappearance. She wasn't done. She took him back to family court for 23 years of unpaid child support, retroactive, with interest. An Indiana magistrate looked at what Richard had done, the maxed-out credit cards, the fraudulent loan, the abandonment, the fact that he'd apparently been comfortable enough in Florida to buy an airplane while his sons went without, and slapped him with a $1.86 million bill. almost $2 million owed to the family he'd walked away from. Richard showed up to court in thrift store clothes, trying to look poor. The judge, in a ruling that will live rent-free in my head forever, called him out for it in writing. Basically said, "You owned a plane, please." Whether Linda ever sees that money is another question entirely, because Richard's remaining assets are all tangled up in a divorce with his second wife in Florida. So this whole thing ends the way it started, with financial devastation trailing behind Richard like a comet's tail. And here's my final haunting takeaway for you. Somewhere out there right now, two grown men in Indiana, Matthew and Doug Hoagland, are walking around with a father they mourned as a child, lost as a teenager, and got back as a stranger in handcuffs. And somewhere in Florida, a young man is walking around who thought his last name was Szymanski for the first 20 years of his life. 3 sons, 2 states, 1 father, a father who was, from the very beginning, a completely hollow performance. The chilling truth of Richard Hoagland's story isn't that he fooled the government, it's that he fooled the people who loved him. And he did it not for months, not for a year, for 23 years. And he almost got away with it. Imagine you're a woman in your early 50s living in Fort Worth, Texas. It's late 2022. Life has been hard, real hard. You were raised by a mother who never loved you. You survived abuse. You ran away as a teenager. You've been through hell. But you've built something now. You have children. You have a name. Your name is Melanie. Then one day, you get a phone call. And a stranger on the other end of the line tells you that everything you thought you knew about yourself is a lie. Your name isn't Melanie. Your birthday isn't your birthday. The woman you called Mom your whole life is not your mother. And in fact, she probably kidnapped you as a toddler more than half a century ago from an apartment complex just a few miles from where you're sitting right now. Because a family in Fort Worth just took a $99 DNA test on a whim. And that DNA test just cracked a 51-year-old cold case that the FBI, local police, and half a century of national headlines could not. This is the story of Melissa Highsmith and how one of the longest missing persons cases in American history was solved not by a detective, but by a spit tube in the mail. Let me take you back. August 1971, Fort Worth, Texas. If you weren't around back then, let me set the vibe for you. This is peak Nixon-era America. Vietnam is still going. Watergate hasn't happened yet. The summer heat in North Texas is the kind that shimmers off the parking lots and makes the air feel like breathing through a wet blanket. Everyone's got a window unit AC running in the window that's either working or dying, no in between. And in one small apartment at a complex called Spanish Gate on East Seminary Drive, a 22-year-old woman named Alta Apantenko is holding her whole life together with dental floss. Only Alta has a 21-month-old daughter, Melissa Suzanne Highsmith, blonde, chubby cheeks, just learning to walk properly, just starting to string a few words together. And Alta adores this child, but Alta is struggling. She's newly divorced, she's 22 years old, she's working long shifts as a waitress at a local restaurant because that paycheck is the only thing standing between her and homelessness. And this is 1971. There's no such thing as a corporate daycare. There's no mommy blog. There's no vetted childcare app on your phone. If you're a working single mom in 1971 and you don't have grandma next door, your options are the classifieds in the newspaper. So Alta does what everyone did. She takes out a little ad, babysitter wanted, Fort Worth. Call this number. The atmosphere here is desperation, not neglect, not carelessness. Just a young woman running on fumes, praying that the universe sends her a nice church lady who charges by the hour. And she waits. The phone rings. A woman on the other end says her name is Ruth Johnson. She sounds warm. She sounds motherly. She sounds like an answered prayer. Alta arranges to meet Ruth Johnson in person at the restaurant where she works. That's the responsible thing to do, right? Meet the babysitter face to face before you hand her your child. But Ruth doesn't show up to the meeting. She just doesn't come. And then she calls again. She apologizes. Something came up. And then she talks Alta into skipping the in-person interview entirely. She'll just come by the apartment tomorrow morning and pick the baby up on the way. It'll be fine. Easier this way. Alta's shift starts early, and Alta, exhausted, broke, terrified of losing her waitress job if she can't find childcare by tomorrow, says yes. The next morning, August 23rd, 1971. Alta has already left for work by the time the doorbell rings. Her roommate answers, and standing at the door is a woman, impeccably dressed, a little bonnet on her head, and long white gloves. Now hold on. Sit with that image for a second. White gloves, in August, in Fort Worth, Texas, in a 100-degree Texas summer. Nobody wears long white gloves to pick up a toddler in Fort Worth in August 1971. Nobody. But the roommate doesn't clock it. She hands over Melissa. She hands over diapers. She hands over a little pink dress and a pair of white sandals. She smiles. She waves. She closes the door. And Melissa Highsmith is gone. When Alta gets home from work that night and the babysitter hasn't returned her baby, panic sets in fast. She calls the number Ruth Johnson had used. It doesn't work. She calls the police. Fort Worth PD comes out. Eventually, the FBI gets involved. Missing persons posters go up. But nothing, no leads, no suspect, no trace of Ruth Johnson, no trace of a 21-month-old girl. The trail doesn't just go cold. There is no trail. And now the second, uglier tragedy begins. Because when a baby goes missing and there's no evidence, the police start looking at the parents. And they don't stop looking. For decades, Fort Worth detectives interrogated Alta more than once. And even worse than the cops, the whispers started in the community. Relatives, neighbors, strangers on the street, all of them slowly convinced themselves of the same thing. She did it herself. There was no Ruth Johnson. She killed her own baby. Alta had to live under that cloud for 51 years. 51 years of being the mom who probably murdered her own child. And every single year, she and her family did the same thing. They held on to hope. They held on to Melissa's little pink dress. They kept believing she was alive somewhere. Fast forward, 2022. The Highsmith family gets an anonymous tip that supposedly places Melissa in South Carolina. It turns out to be nothing, but that flurry of media attention reignites the case in the news, and more importantly, it puts an idea in the family's head. Let's take DNA tests. Let's upload them everywhere. Let's throw everything at the wall. They do. And within weeks, a match pops back on 23andMe. Not to Melissa herself, but to Melissa's children. 3 of them, living right there in Fort Worth. Detectives track her down. She's living as a woman named Melanie. She's in her early 50s, and when they show her the family photos and the DNA report and the story of the 21-month-old toddler who vanished in 1971 from Spanish Gate Apartments, her whole life implodes because she is Melissa Highsmith, and the woman she has called Mom for her entire existence, the woman who abused her, the woman she ran away from as a teenager, is the woman in the white gloves. On November 26, 2022, 51 years and 3 months after she was carried out of an apartment door, Melissa Highsmith is hugged by her biological mother, Alta, for the first time. Okay, hold on. Let's break down the sheer impossibility of this case, because it stretches belief in a bunch of different directions. Let's start with the proximity paradox. Usually, when someone kidnaps a child, they run. They cross state lines, they change their appearance, they pack up the whole life and go 3,000 miles away, disappear into a completely new city, become new people. That's the playbook. That's what makes sense. The woman who took Melissa did none of that. She raised Melissa in Fort Worth, the same Fort Worth, the exact same city where Melissa's face was on the front page of the local newspaper, the exact same city where Fort Worth PD had an open file on the case, the exact same city where Alta Apantenko was living, working, and searching for half a century. Melissa went to school in Fort Worth. She worked jobs in Fort Worth. She walked around Fort Worth. She had children in Fort Worth. She was probably in the same grocery stores as her real mother. She may have driven past her biological grandparents on the road. She was hiding, but she was hiding in the last place you'd ever look, which is exactly where anyone with common sense would say she couldn't possibly be. And she wasn't in a compound. She wasn't in a locked basement. She was just living. Right there. For 5 decades. Now let's talk about the torture inflicted on Alta. Because I don't think we talk about this enough with cases like this. Imagine losing your baby to a stranger through no fault of your own. Now imagine that for the next 51 years, half a century, you're not just grieving. You're being accused. People in your own life are convinced you killed her. Detectives call you back in for questioning periodically, just in case. Family members raise eyebrows at Thanksgiving. Strangers on true crime forums, once the internet arrives, speculate that you're a murderer. You go to bed every night with the weight of a missing child and the weight of being blamed for that child's disappearance. For 51 years, Alta lived with a suspicion so heavy it would have crushed most people into silence. She never gave up. She never went into hiding. She kept doing the birthday parties. She kept talking to the media. She kept insisting Melissa was alive. And the whole time, the actual kidnapper, the woman in the white gloves, was living a few zip codes away, playing house with a stolen child, raising Alta's daughter into a woman who wouldn't even know her real mother's name. And then there's the third impossibility, the DNA revolution. Because this case did not get solved by traditional detective work. It just didn't. 51 years of Fort Worth PD, FBI involvement, national television coverage, missing children's databases, age progression sketches, forensic analysis, thousands of tips, none of it worked. Not a single lead panned out. The kidnapper had, by every conventional metric, gotten away with it. If Melissa had died of old age, never having taken a DNA test, this case would still be an unsolved mystery. She got caught by a mail-order spit tube from a genealogy company. 51 years of law enforcement expertise, defeated by consumer biotech that costs less than a decent pair of jeans. And when Melissa's kids, Alta's biological grandkids that she didn't know existed, spat into that little tube, they cracked open a case that should have been mathematically unsolvable. Which raises the same haunting question we keep bumping into with these cases. How many other Melissas are out there? How many other cold cases are 123 and me kid away from resolution? But here's the twist within the twist. Because Melissa didn't just discover she was kidnapped, she discovered who kidnapped her. Confronted with the DNA results, the woman who raised her allegedly gave a wild story. She claimed she had paid a stranger $500 to take Melissa in 1972. She claimed some other woman handed the baby over to her in a random transaction on the street. The Highsmith family doesn't buy it. They believe this woman was the Ruth Johnson in the white gloves, the same person who set up the babysitting job, the same person who walked into Alta's apartment complex, took the baby, and then spent the next 51 years raising her while lying to her about her name, her birthday, her origin, everything. And here's where the story gets really cruel. Because Melissa's childhood was not happy. She has said publicly that the woman who raised her was emotionally abusive. She has said she suffered severe mistreatment and physical abuse at the hands of a stepfather. She ran away from home at 15 years old, ending up on the streets, doing whatever it took to survive. She lost her own children to the state foster system before eventually rebuilding her life. Alta raised a family of siblings who mourned her. Meanwhile, Melissa was down the road being tortured by the woman who stole her. And here's where the story enters truly agonizing legal territory. Because you would think, obviously, that stealing a child and raising her for 51 years under a false identity would be one of the most prosecutable crimes imaginable. It's not. The statute of limitations for kidnapping in Texas ran out 20 years after Melissa's 18th birthday. That clock started ticking a long, long time ago. By the time the DNA test came back in 2022, the legal window to charge the woman had, in every practical sense, already slammed shut. Even with a full confession, the reality is that prosecuting this crime in the traditional sense is nearly impossible. Half a century of a stolen life, and no criminal accountability. That is one of the ugliest realities of extremely cold cases. The system was built assuming crimes get solved within a reasonable window. When cases stretch beyond human lifespans, the law kind of just gives up. But something else happened that no law can measure. Alta Apantenko, who had spent 51 years being whispered about, being suspected, being blamed, Alta was completely vindicated. In one afternoon, she went from being the mom people privately thought had killed her baby to being the mom who had been telling the truth the whole time, every single day of those 51 years. And now, she had the daughter she'd been searching for standing right in front of her. Melissa officially reclaimed her name. She took her biological family to Universal Orlando. Because the truth is, at 51 years old, this is a woman who never got to be a kid. She never got the normal childhood. She never got the parents who loved her. She never got the birthdays. So the Highsmiths tried to give her some of that back, as much as they possibly could. But here's my final haunting takeaway for you. Because in the middle of the joy and the vindication, Melissa is carrying something that no reunion can fix. She had to sit with the realization that the woman she called mom for her entire life, the woman whose face she thought of when she thought of the word mother, was the woman who stole her. Every abuse memory, every hurtful moment, every time she was made to feel unloved and unwanted as a child, all of it now has a much darker context, because the person who was supposed to love her was actually the person who ripped her from a mother who would have loved her, completely, unconditionally, forever. Melissa has said she doesn't feel like she fits anywhere anymore. 2 names, 2 lives, 51 lost years. And somewhere in Fort Worth, the woman in the white gloves lived long enough to see herself exposed and never has to face a single day in prison for it. That's the ugly truth this case leaves you with. Sometimes the system fails so badly that even when the truth finally comes out, half a century late, the ending isn't justice. The ending is just, finally, an answer. And after 51 years of not knowing, sometimes an answer is all a mother needs. Imagine you're a 35-year-old software salesman in Philadelphia. It's a Tuesday night in 2011. You've had a normal day. Sales calls, emails, traffic. Now you're on the couch, laptop open, browsing the internet. You've been reading a news story about another famous kidnapping, a woman named Carlina White who solved her own abduction, and it stirs something in you. Because here's the thing. You've always known you were adopted, from Hawaii of all places. You don't know much beyond that. You're blonde, you're blue-eyed, you've got fair Scandinavian skin, but your original birth certificate says you're half native Hawaiian. That's never made sense to you. Not once. Not looking in the mirror your whole life. So on a whim, you click over to missingkids.com, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. You start scrolling. Age-progressed photos of kids who vanished decades ago. Digital art of what they'd look like today. And then, right in the middle of the page, one image stops you cold. It's your face, not sort of your face, not vaguely. Your face. A forensic artist somewhere aged up a 6-month-old baby into a 35-year-old man, and that 35-year-old man is you. The name under the photo isn't Steve Carter. The name is Marks Panama Barnes. And that is the moment Steve Carter realizes he has been a missing person his entire adult life, and he never knew it. This is the story of a man who solved his own 34-year-old kidnapping by clicking a link on a Tuesday night. Let me take you back. June 1977. Hau'ula, on the north shore of the island of Oahu, Hawaii. Postcard territory, palm trees, surf breaking on black lava rock, slow-moving traffic on a 2-lane road. That soft, humid trade wind that makes you understand why people move to Hawaii and never leave. It's a specific vibe. It's the 70s. It's paradise. And in a small home on that island lives a family. A father named Mark Barnes, a mother named Charlotte Moriarty, and a 6-month-old baby boy named Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes. From the outside, this looks like a normal little family living the island dream. Young parents, cute baby, community. But inside that house, something is off. Because Charlotte is not well, not in the having a rough week sense. Charlotte has serious documented psychiatric problems. She has a history of dissociative episodes. She disappears sometimes, just wanders off for hours or days at a time, and then reappears. No explanation. This has been the pattern for a while. It's the background noise of Mark's life. Every few weeks, Charlotte just goes. So he's used to it. He worries, sure, but he's used to it. And that is going to matter a lot when I tell you what happens next. Because this is not a case of a child being ripped from a mother's arms by a stranger. There's no kidnapper in a mask. There's no van with tinted windows. There's no crime scene, no broken glass, no blood on the carpet. What happens to baby Mark's Panama Barnes is quieter than that, stranger than that, and in some ways, way more disturbing. June 21st, 1977. Charlotte tells Mark she's taken the baby for a walk down to the grocery store. Nothing unusual about that. She puts Mark's in his stroller. She heads out the front door. Mark keeps doing whatever dads do on a Tuesday afternoon. She doesn't come back. But because Charlotte has this history of disappearing for a day or two at a time and then wandering home, Mark doesn't freak out. Not at first. This is her pattern. She'll be back. He waits. A day passes, then 2, then a week, then 2 weeks. And this time, she's not coming back. This time is different. 3 weeks in, Mark finally reports Charlotte and baby Mark's missing to the Honolulu Police Department, and the manhunt begins. But here's what Mark does not know, and what the Honolulu Police Department does not put together. Because at almost the exact same time Mark is reporting his family missing on one side of the island, a woman is being arrested on the other side. A woman who's been squatting in a stranger's empty house, a woman with a small blonde baby. And when the police arrest her, they ask her the standard questions. What's your name? She says her name is Jane Amaya, or Amy. Reports vary on the spelling. And the baby? She says his name is Tenzin. Who's the father? She says he's native Hawaiian. None of that is true. She is Charlotte Moriarty. The baby is Mark's Panama Barnes. And the father is Mark Barnes, a Caucasian man who has just filed a missing persons report a few miles away. But because Charlotte is having a psychotic episode, and because the police in 1977 have no way to cross-reference a squatting arrest on one side of the island with a missing persons report on the other, the system just processes her. Charlotte gets sent to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation, and the baby, the one with the fake name and the fake background, gets absorbed into the Hawaiian state foster care system, not as Mark's Panama Barnes, as Tenzin Amy. A completely made-up person that doesn't exist. For 3 years, this little boy bounces through the foster system under a name his mother invented in a delusion. And in 1980, at age 4, he gets adopted by a nice American military family, Pat and Victoria Carter, who are completely unaware they are adopting someone else's kidnapped child. They rename him Steve. They love him. They eventually move him to southern New Jersey. He grows up completely normal. Suburban American childhood, Little League, school dances, college, a career in software sales, nothing weird. Except that his skin is fair, his hair's blonde, his eyes are blue, and on his official Hawaiian paperwork, his birth certificate says he's half native Hawaiian. That contradiction sits at the back of Steve Carter's brain for 30 years. He knows he was adopted. His parents were always open about it. But nobody can explain the paperwork. Nobody can explain the mismatch between what's written on the page and the face staring back at him in the mirror. Then one night in 2011, he goes online. He clicks the wrong link. And there he is. Mark's Panama Moriarty Barnes, missing since 1977. An age-progressed photo that could be his driver's license. The DNA test takes 8 months to process. And when it comes back, 34 years, 8 months, and a couple of weeks after Charlotte pushed that stroller out the door in Hawaii, Steve Carter finally learns his own name. Okay, hold on. Let's break down the sheer impossibility of this, because this case has some of the most baffling logic gaps of any missing persons case ever. Let me start with the systemic failure, the orphanage anomaly, because you have to sit with this one for a second. At the exact same time that the Honolulu Police Department has an active missing persons file for a 6-month-old Caucasian baby named Mark's Panama Barnes, the exact same police department also arrests a mentally unstable woman with a 6-month-old Caucasian baby in the exact same city, on the exact same island, and no one connects them. How? How is that even possible? Well, here's how. Charlotte gave a false name. She gave a fake background. She said the baby was named Tenzin, and she said the father was native Hawaiian. And in 1977, No shared databases, no digital records, no photo cross-referencing. The police just wrote down what she said. There was no reason to doubt her. She's the mother. She's the source. She's authoritative. So the missing baby file goes into one drawer, and the arrested baby file goes into another drawer, and those two drawers never see each other again. And it gets worse, because the baby was subsequently passed to the Hawaiian State Child Welfare System. That is a system that is specifically designed to identify and protect vulnerable, at-risk children. That is literally its entire job. And they processed a 6-month-old boy with a made-up name from an actively psychotic mother at exactly the same time and place as a nationally reported missing infant case. And they did not stop. Not once, not to say, wait, hold on, is this the missing kid? They just gave him a foster family. They eventually gave him an adoption, and a legitimate American military family flew home to New Jersey unknowingly holding a kidnapped Hawaiian boy in their arms. The system was so broken that it turned a state government into an unwitting accomplice to a kidnapping. And here's the second big logic gap: the forensic art anomaly. Because let's talk about how absurd Steve's self-discovery actually was. He went to a website, he looked at a computer-generated image, and that image was accurate enough of a person who had last been seen at 6 months old, that at 35, he immediately recognized it as himself. That is bonkers. Think about what a 6-month-old looks like. Round little face, no real bone structure yet, no expression lines, no adult features, basically a soft potato with eyes. Now think about what you look like at 35. Different bone structure entirely, different everything. Aging a 6-month-old to a full-grown adult is not science. It's like reconstructing a full oak tree from a single acorn. There's no way to do it that shouldn't be riddled with errors. And somehow, some forensic artist working for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, somehow, using nothing but a baby photo and some general assumptions about how faces mature, produced an image so eerily accurate that a random guy in Philadelphia scrolling through the internet at night went, "That's me." That's not police work. That's not detective work. That's basically magic. And here's the third and darkest logic gap, and this is where the story gets really uncomfortable. Steve Carter got his answer. He found himself. He called his biological father Mark Barnes in California. 34 years of grief on the other end of the phone. Then he learned he had a biological half-sister, Jennifer, who had spent years fighting to get the police to reopen the cold case. Beautiful reunion, emotional, real. But what about Charlotte? Because Steve found himself. But Charlotte, the woman who took him, she is still missing. She walked out of that psychiatric hospital in the late 1970s, and she has not been seen since. Not for decades. She is a ghost. Did she die? Did she wander off into another episode and never come back? Did she pull the same alias trick and slip into a whole different life somewhere? Did somebody hurt her? We don't know. Nobody knows. So Steve solved his own kidnapping. But by solving it, he cracked open a much bigger, much older, much scarier mystery. What happened to Charlotte Moriarty? Where did she go? Is she out there right now, aging in some other state, under some other made-up name, with no memory of the baby she once pushed in a stroller through a Hawaii neighborhood? There's no answer. There's just her silhouette hovering over this whole story. And I want you to sit for a second with the psychological horror of Steve's Tuesday night in 2011. Because we joke about it, but really, pause. You're 35. You have a career. You have friends. You have a favorite coffee shop, a favorite show, a phone plan, a driver's license. You have a whole life you have built brick by brick since kindergarten. And on a Tuesday night at 9 p.m., you click a link on a website, and every single one of those bricks turns out to have been laid on top of a lie you never knew was there. Your name is not your name. Your birthday is off by a day. Your ethnicity is wrong. Your origin story is wrong. Your paperwork is wrong. How do you go to work on Wednesday? How do you sit in a sales meeting on Thursday? How do you order coffee on Friday and let the barista call you by a name that suddenly feels borrowed? Steve has said gently in interviews that it took him a long time to process this. which is honestly one of the great understatements of our lifetime. And here's the strangely warm ending of the Steve Carter story. Because unlike a lot of these cases, this one actually has a lot of love in it. Pat and Victoria Carter, his adoptive parents, turned out to be completely, totally innocent. They followed every rule. They went through a legitimate American adoption process. They loved this boy. They raised him. They gave him a good life. When the truth came out, they didn't lose him. Steve remained their son. He was clear about that. His biological father, Mark Barnes, got to meet his lost boy 34 years later. That phone call, the first phone call, was reportedly one of the most emotional moments of Mark's life. He didn't get to raise his son, but he got to know him, and that is more than he had at any point in the previous 3.5 decades. So in a sense, Steve got the win. He got answers. He got both families. He got the truth. But here's my final haunting takeaway for you. Because underneath the reunion, this case is haunted. It's haunted by Charlotte. Somewhere in the deep archives of Hawaiian state records is a woman named Jane Amea, who does not exist. Somewhere in the world, or possibly not, is a woman named Charlotte Moriarty, who once, in the middle of a mental breakdown, took her baby son for a walk to the store and then disappeared forever. Steve solved his half of the mystery, but Charlotte's half is still open, and it always will be. Because there is no forensic artist, no DNA site, no missing persons registry that can find a woman who has been actively erasing herself since the 1970s. The strangest thing about the Steve Carter case is that solving it didn't close a chapter. It opened one. Steve is now a man who knows exactly where he came from and also knows that the woman who brought him into the world is out there somewhere, aging or dead, and he will probably never, ever know which. That's the ghost at the edge of this story. Charlotte, wherever she is, still walking, still gone. Imagine you're 20 years old and you live on the Sunshine Coast of Queensland, Australia. It's a beautiful morning. Cockatoos in the trees, kookaburras laughing somewhere, waves on the beach a few streets over. Your name is Samantha. You're in nursing school. You live at home with your mom, Alex, who has always been your best friend in the whole world. And then, at breakfast one morning in November 2013, everything explodes. Australian Federal Police smash through the door. FBI agents follow them in. You watch, frozen, as they tackle your mother to the floor and put her in handcuffs. And then one of the agents pulls up a chair, sits down across from you, and calmly explains that the woman being taken away in the back of that squad car is not who you think she is. Her name isn't Alex. Her name is Dorothy Lee Barnett. She is one of the most wanted international kidnapping fugitives on the FBI's list. And you, Samantha, are actually Savannah Todd, a girl who was abducted at 11 months old from a small coastal town in South Carolina 19 years ago. A girl whose father, a man you have never met, on the other side of the planet, has spent his entire adult life mourning you and never stopped looking. This is the story of a mother's most extreme act of love, or her most extreme act of revenge, depending entirely on who you ask. Let me take you back. Early 1994, Isle of Palms, South Carolina. If you've never been, imagine a slim little barrier island just off the coast of Charleston. Seagrass, salt marshes, long wooden bridges, blue herons standing motionless in the shallows. This is Old South money territory. Historic, conservative, high society, quiet in that Charleston way. And on this island, a beautiful and completely toxic marriage is falling apart. Benjamin Harris Todd III, everybody calls him Harris, is a very successful stockbroker. Old name wealth, country club, Charleston pedigree. His wife, Dorothy Lee Barnett, is a flight attendant, beautiful, adventurous, magnetic, described by people who knew her as a force of nature. And in the early 90s, Harris and Dorothy have a baby, a little girl. They name her Savannah. But by the time Savannah is 11 months old, this marriage isn't just failing. It's on fire. There are dueling allegations flying around a Charleston courtroom. Harris is accused of being emotionally abusive. Dorothy is accused of being unstable. Doctors testify, family members testify, friends take sides. It becomes the longest custody trial in the county's history at that time. 13 straight days of legal warfare over one baby. And then the judge makes a ruling that, in 1994, is honestly kind of shocking. The judge awards full custody to the father, not shared custody, not primary custody with weekend visits, full custody. Dorothy loses her rights as a mother. The court's reasoning includes concerns about her mental state. She's diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and her behavior throughout the trial. She's given only limited, supervised visitation. To Harris and his family, this is a hard-fought victory. To Dorothy, this is a cataclysm. She believes the court is corrupt. She believes the system has been bought. She believes her ex-husband is a monster who is about to hurt her baby. And in her mind, apparently, that means the rules of society no longer apply to her. April 23, 1994. A court-supervised weekend visit is scheduled. Dorothy is allowed to take Savannah to a family birthday party. That's the whole plan. Bring the kid, watch her blow out candles, bring her back. Dorothy is not planning to bring her back. She easily slips supervision at the party. She takes Savannah, she leaves the state. And by the time Harris shows up to collect his daughter later that weekend, the house is empty. Not kind of cleaned out, empty, wiped down. Nothing on the counters, no clothes in the closets, and in one particularly diabolical little touch, Dorothy has left a map of Central America lying around, just so the FBI, when they inevitably show up, will race off in that direction. She was never going to Central America. That was a decoy. She was going a lot farther than that. The FBI gets involved almost immediately. Harris hires private investigators. He pours millions of dollars into finding his daughter. Dorothy's face goes on TV. Wanted posters go up. Interpol gets a file. And Dorothy does not just disappear. She evaporates. Because what she pulls off next is honestly one of the most impressive fugitive runs in modern true crime. She goes to France, then Germany, then Malaysia, then New Zealand, then South Africa, and finally, Australia. Along the way, she acquires a new identity, Alexandria Maria Cantone, and later Alexandria Geldenhuis, after she marries a South African man named Juan Geldenhuis. She has another child with him, a son. She becomes a mom of two. She lives for years at a time in beautiful, sun-drenched, off-the-grid corners of the world. And little Savannah? Savannah grows up thinking her name is Samantha, her mom is Alex, her dad is Juan. She has a little brother. She travels the world with them. She lives what she will later describe, without a hint of irony, as a Swiss Family Robinson childhood. Beaches, passports, adventures. A loving mother who tells her wonderful stories about their family history, all of which are, obviously, invented. Meanwhile, back in South Carolina, Harris Todd is dying inside. He lives alone in a house full of nursery furniture that was never used. He goes to sleep every night not knowing if his daughter's alive or dead. He keeps her room the way it was. He keeps hoping. For 19 years, not 19 months, 19 years. Then, in 2011, the FBI gets a tip, a real one. Dorothy is somewhere in Australia. They coordinate with Australian Federal Police. It takes them 2 years of quiet tracking, and on November 4th, 2013, they knock on a door in Queensland. 19 years, 6 months, and 11 days after Dorothy walked out of that South Carolina birthday party with Savannah in her arms, the game is over. Okay, hold on. Let's break down the sheer logistics of this, because Dorothy Lee Barnett didn't just get away. She pulled off something that should not have been possible. Start with the international evasion, because we take for granted in 2026 how much surveillance there is on international travel. Facial recognition at airports, biometric passports, shared databases between countries, Interpol red notices that ping the second your name is scanned. Post 9/11, the whole system got locked down. But Dorothy started running in 1994. That's pre-internet globally, pre-9/11, pre-modern surveillance. And she kept running through the 2000s when all of that infrastructure was being built around her. And she somehow just kept slipping through the seams. How? Let's break down the sheer logistics of this. First, she forged documents. She acquired new identities. She got a birth certificate, a passport, a driver's license in the name of Alexandria Canton, and later, Geldenhuis. Every single one of those documents was fake, or built on top of fake documentation, and she rolled through international customs again and again and again without getting flagged. She crossed the borders of France, Germany, Malaysia, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. Each one of those crossings should have been an opportunity for the system to catch her. It never did. Even weirder, in 2003 and 2004, she actually applied for a U.S. passport under her fake name from overseas. She was so confident in her fake identity that she reached back into the American system voluntarily. Those applications left a digital breadcrumb that helped the FBI eventually zero in on her. But it took years, because the trail was so tangled, and she wasn't traveling light. She was doing this with a growing child in tow, not a baby you can pass off as anything. A growing girl who eventually had a first day of school, needed medical records, needed vaccines, needed birthday certificates for enrollment. Every single one of those bureaucratic touchpoints was a potential trap, and every single time, Dorothy talked her way through it. That is not luck. That is discipline. That is a woman running a con so total, so well rehearsed, that she basically became her cover story. Now let's talk about the psychology of that, because I want you to sit with this for a second. For 19 years, Dorothy Lee Barnett got up every morning and looked into the eyes of her own daughter, and every day she lied. She lied about the girl's name, she lied about her birthday, she lied about where she was from. She lied about who her father was. She lied about the very country the girl was born in. Every single interaction, every "I love you," every scraped knee, every bedtime story was performed inside an ongoing, decades-long deception. That is not something the average person can maintain. Most people crack. Most people confess. Most people, in an unguarded moment at 2 a.m., look at their sleeping kid and just blurt it out. Dorothy never did, not once, not in 19 years. And she wasn't just holding the story together for Savannah. She was holding it together for her second husband, for her second child, for in-laws, for the girl's teachers, for her neighbors, for random people at the grocery store who asked innocent questions. Every conversation was a potential landmine, and she walked through 19 years of them without stepping on one. But here's the truly wild wrinkle. Because she wasn't just cold and calculating, there was another layer. Dorothy, this entire time, was secretly keeping a diary. A diary written directly to Savannah, meant to be handed to her someday when the girl came of age, full of memories of Charleston, blue herons, shrimp boils, the salt marsh, and full of Dorothy's justifications for what she'd done. Her side of the story, her love letter, her defense. She was preparing for a confession she planned to make on her own terms. She just never expected the FBI to make it for her. And you want to hear how her whole empire finally cracked? It wasn't Interpol. It wasn't a forensic breakthrough. It wasn't advanced AI or facial recognition. It was a slip of the tongue. At some point in South Africa, in front of her husband's relatives, Dorothy accidentally called her daughter Savannah instead of Samantha. Once, in passing, but it was enough. The name stuck in someone's ear. Someone Googled it later, and when the internet spat back that Savannah Todd was a missing American child from 1994 with a striking family resemblance, the whole 19-year construction started to collapse. One word, that was it. One name, said out loud instead of held in. Now, let's talk about the third and most disturbing part of this case. Because when the FBI walked into that Queensland house in November 2013, and told a 20-year-old nursing student that her entire life was a lie, everyone expected a certain reaction. Horror, anger, betrayal, the classic, "How could you do this to me, Mom" moment. That's not what happened. Samantha, or Savannah, depending on who you asked, did the opposite. She stood by her mother, fiercely, publicly. She went in front of Australian cameras and later a U.S. federal court and defended Dorothy. She told the world she'd had a beautiful childhood. She told the world she was loved. She told the judge she was asking for leniency. And she refused, absolutely refused, to go back to the name Savannah. She stayed Samantha. The father, Harris, The man who had been searching for her since he'd changed her diapers got a reunion. Kind of. It happened. But it was not the reunion he'd been dreaming about for 19 years. He was meeting a young adult who didn't know him, who was polite, who had been raised on a story that painted him, at best, as absent, and at worst, as dangerous. There was no rushing into his arms. There was no picking up where they left off. There was just this careful, awkward, painful meeting of two strangers who happened to share DNA. And this is what makes this case so hard to sit with. Because there is no clean villain here. There is no clean victim. Dorothy did an unquestionably horrible thing. She kidnapped a baby. She stole 19 years of a father's life. She weaponized international borders. She lied to her own daughter every single day for 2 decades. And she gave that daughter a happy, loving, adventurous childhood, full of travel, full of siblings, full of birthday cakes and beach trips. Both of those things are true at the same time. Dorothy eventually pleaded guilty in February 2015 in Charleston federal court to international parental kidnapping and passport fraud. She went to federal prison, and when she got out, her daughter was there waiting, still calling her mom, still calling herself Samantha. Here's my final haunting takeaway for you. In most kidnapping cases, when the truth comes out, everything snaps back to reality. The stolen child goes home, the kidnapper goes to prison, the real family gets to rebuild. There's a neat resolution. The Savannah Todd case explodes that whole idea. Because it turns out you cannot undo 19 years of childhood. You cannot delete the mother who read her bedtime stories in Malaysia. You cannot delete the little brother she taught to swim in Australia. You cannot delete the last name that shows up on her nursing school certificate. Those are all real. Those all exist. Those are her. And so is Savannah. So is Charleston. So is the little pink bedroom in Isle of Palms that Harris Todd kept preserved like a shrine for 19 years, waiting for an occupant who would never move back in. Somewhere in the world right now, a young woman in her 30s carries both of those lives inside her. 2 names, 2 families, 2 continents, 2 versions of the truth. And she has to wake up every day and pick which pieces of herself she wants to acknowledge. Dorothy Lee Barnett won. In some deep, disturbing way, she actually won. She lost her freedom. She lost her marriage. She lost her fake life. But the daughter she stole, the daughter she raised on a lie, the daughter still calls her mom. And Harris Todd, the man who never stopped searching, has to live with the reality that the little girl he lost never really came home. Not fully. Not in the way he'd been imagining every night for 19 years. That's not a happy ending. That's not even really an ending. That's just what happens when love and cruelty walk out the same front door. Imagine you're a police officer in Rock Hill, New York. It's December 2022. You get called out to an untimely death. A middle-aged handyman, apartment in the back of a small building. Roommate found him unresponsive that morning. Natural causes, nothing dramatic. Sad, but normal. You go to process the scene. You go through the guy's paperwork. His name is Richard King. He's been living quietly in this town for years. Nobody knows much about him. He fixed things. He kept to himself. Good tenant. But when you dig through the drawers of his tiny apartment, you find something weird. A stray document, nothing dramatic, just a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper is a completely different name. Robert Hoagland. That name means nothing to you. You Google it, and your Sunday afternoon just falls apart. Because Robert Hoagland has been one of the most publicized missing persons cases in the entire northeastern United States for the last 9 years. His face has been on the cover of the investigation discovery series Disappeared. His wife has spent nearly a decade begging for answers. Police in Connecticut have chased drug dealers, cartels, and murder theories trying to figure out what happened to him. And he's been in a small town in the Catskills the whole time, 3 hours from home, under a different name. He's dead on the floor in front of you. This is the story of the Connecticut father who walked out of his own life carrying literally nothing and pulled off the most quietly devastating disappearance you've never heard of. Let me take you back. Late July 2013, Sandy Hook, Newtown, Connecticut. If you've ever been to that part of New England, you know the vibe. Old stone walls along country roads, big trees hanging over the streets, nice homes on nice lots. This is the kind of picturesque, affluent Connecticut town where kids ride bikes without helmets, and everybody knows the barista's name at the local coffee shop. And in one comfortable house in this comfortable town lives the Hoagland family. Robert Hoagland, everyone calls him Hoagie, is 50 years old. Big guy, trained as a chef, recently pivoted into working as a real estate appraiser and just started at a local law firm. His wife, Lori, is a culinary arts teacher. They have 3 grown sons. From the outside, it's the model Connecticut middle-class family. 2-income household, grown kids, solid, stable, the good years. But behind that front door, the good years are in serious trouble because the Hoaglands are living through something a lot of American families were living through in 2013, the opioid crisis. Their 24-year-old son, Max, is deep in the middle of a severe substance abuse issue, and Robert especially is losing sleep over it. He's changed jobs partly so he can be home more, so he can supervise Max, so he can help his son claw his way out of this thing. And the whole household is under strain because of it. 2 laptops have recently gone missing from the house. Robert thinks Max stole them and traded them to fuel his habit. The atmosphere in that home is not the picturesque Connecticut vibe you'd guess from the outside. It's tense, it's stressed. It's a father who is watching his son's life fall apart in slow motion and who is spending every ounce of himself trying to hold the family together. And then, on a summer weekend in late July 2013, Robert just stops. Let me walk you through the timeline because it's incredibly precise and every detail is going to matter in a minute. Thursday, July 25th. Someone withdraws $600 from a family bank account. That's it. Not the retirement funds, not the emergency savings, just $600. Enough to matter, but not enough to trip alarms. Sunday morning, July 28th. Robert goes out and gets bagels for the family. Totally normal. Then he swings by a local mobile gas station on Churchill Road, and he does 2 things there. He buys fuel, and he buys a road map. That gas station security camera catches him doing it. Just a middle-aged guy running errands. He comes home, he plays online Scrabble, he mows the lawn, because that's what dads do on a Sunday. He talks to Max, he says goodbye to Max, casual, nothing dramatic, just, see you later. And then he vanishes. Monday, July 29th. Lori Hoagland is flying home from a trip to Turkey. She's expecting her husband to pick her up at the airport. Robert isn't there. She figures traffic, maybe he got tied up. She eventually gets herself home, and that's when she starts to notice things. Robert's cars are still in the driveway, both of them. His shoes are still lined up by the door. Inside the house, on the counter, is everything a man would need if he were going anywhere at all. His wallet, his driver's license, his credit cards, his cell phone, his passport, and critically, his blood pressure medication. Robert had a heart condition. He needed those pills every day. He didn't take any of it, not one thing, which means police, when they arrive, come to the same obvious conclusion any of us would. Something bad happened to this man. Because guys don't just voluntarily walk away from their own life without a wallet, without ID, without medication, without shoes. That doesn't happen. That is not a plan. That is a crime scene. And so a massive investigation kicks off. Bloodhounds get called in. They pick up Robert's scent, follow it a little ways, and then lose it. Detectives fan out. They interview friends, family, co-workers. They lean hard on Max, on Max's associates, on anyone who might have wanted to hurt Robert. Because remember, just days before he vanished, Robert had apparently confronted the people supplying his son at an abandoned factory in Bridgeport. It's a big, dramatic, cinematic red herring, and police latch onto it hard. The prevailing theory becomes Robert Hoagland was targeted by his son's dangerous associates in retaliation. That's what everyone believes for years. His face goes on national television. He gets featured on Investigation Discovery's Disappeared. Tips pour in. Nothing sticks. 9 years pass, 9 birthdays, 9 anniversaries, 9 Christmases where Lori sets the table for one less person than she used to. Her sons grow older and mourn a father who never comes home. And then, in December 2022, on the other side of the state line, a handyman named Richard King quietly dies in a small apartment in a town called Rock Hill, New York. And the paperwork on his coffee table blows this whole story open. Okay, hold on. Let's break down the sheer logistics of what Robert Hoagland actually pulled off. Because on paper, it should have been impossible. Let's start with the $0 escape. Because I want you to really sit with what this man walked out of his front door with. Nothing. Literally nothing. No wallet, no ID, no credit cards, no cell phone, no passport, no car, no shoes waiting to be picked up. Just the clothes he was wearing and, we now think, whatever cash he'd stashed from that $600 withdrawal a few days earlier. Try to plan an escape like that. You want to disappear. Okay, how do you rent an apartment with no ID? How do you get a job with no social security card? How do you buy groceries indefinitely on $600? How do you set up utilities without a driver's license? How do you even open a checking account? The answer is, he became Richard King. But how did Robert Hoagland become Richard King? That's the hole at the center of this case that we still don't fully have an answer to. He must have had some system in place, some kind of soft identity waiting for him. Because you don't just introduce yourself as Richard King to a landlord in New York and have that stick for 9 years. Somewhere in there, he must have had documents, some kind of paper trail he'd quietly set up, where he found a landlord who didn't ask questions, took cash under the table, and just let a middle-aged handyman live in the back apartment as long as the rent showed up. There's a whole informal, off-the-books economy in rural America. Handymen who work for cash, rooms rented month to month with no lease, people paid in envelopes. Robert didn't run to Mexico, he didn't fly to Thailand, he didn't need a fake passport or a cartel connection. He just found a small town in the Catskills where nobody asked questions, and he slid quietly into the shadows. Now, let's break down the proximity paradox, because this is where I actually get chills. Rock Hill, New York, is 3 hours from Newtown, Connecticut. 3 hours. That's not another country. That's not another coast. That's a drive you could make in an afternoon. That's within the media market of the metro area where his disappearance was the top news story. Connecticut news reaches into New York. New York news reaches into Connecticut. When Disappeared aired his episode on national cable television, it aired everywhere. For 9 years, Robert Hoagland walked around Rock Hill. He shopped at grocery stores, he went to gas stations, he handled things for people as a handyman, which means he was in and out of strangers' houses constantly. He was seen by dozens of people every single day. His face was on missing persons databases, on investigation discovery, on the local news, on Facebook groups where amateur sleuths pored over cold cases. And nobody recognized him. Nobody. For 9 years. How? Look, maybe the beard grew out. Maybe he lost weight. Maybe he aged in that particular way middle-aged men age when they're carrying a heavy secret. Maybe he just kept his head down and didn't make eye contact. But there's also a deeper truth here about how invisible middle-aged men can be in America if they want to be. Nobody looks twice at a quiet handyman in a small town. Nobody stops him in the produce aisle to make sure he isn't a missing person. He faded into a category of American masculinity, the middle-aged guy who fixes things, that is essentially invisible. And now, let's talk about the third and most devastating logic gap, the paradox of the rings. Because when police finally identified Robert's body in that apartment in December 2022, they noticed something on his hands. 2 rings, his wedding band from Lori, and a second ring, a ring that had been given to him by one of his sons. He was still wearing them. For 9 years. He walked out of his own life. He abandoned his wife of decades. He abandoned his 3 sons. He forced them to live under the shadow of thinking he had met a violent end at the hands of a cartel in some abandoned warehouse. He voluntarily missed his kids' graduations, weddings, milestones, everything. 9 years of Christmases spent as Richard King instead of Robert Hoagland. And the whole time, he was wearing his wedding ring. And his son's ring. Every single day. Right there on his fingers, where he could see them, where he could feel them when he tied his shoes and made his coffee and turned a wrench. That's not a man who erased his family from his heart. That's a man who kept them wrapped around his fingers 24 hours a day for 9 years. That's a man who loved them actively every single day of his exile, which means the whole picture flips upside down. Robert didn't leave because he stopped caring. He left while caring. He walked out with 2 symbols of that family literally on his body. He carried them like a hair shirt, like a punishment, like a secret. And to this day, we don't know exactly why he did it. The best guess is that he was crushed, that the weight of Max's addiction, the missing laptops, the confrontations with dealers, the financial pressure, the exhaustion of being everyone's rock, all of that broke him. And in his broken state, some part of Robert decided that the best thing he could do for his family was subtract himself from the equation, not by his own hand, not through violence, through simple, quiet vanishing. Just stop being the problem. Stop being one more thing they had to worry about. That's the gentlest, saddest reading of this case. And honestly, given the rings, given that he never came home, given that he never called, I think it might be the true one. So here's the punchline of the whole Robert Hoagland case. There were no underworld suppliers. There were no cartel hitmen. There was no basement in New Jersey. There was no body in a lake. There was no murder. There was no crime. The scariest thing in this story turned out to be Robert's own mind. That's what makes it so much heavier than the dramatic theories. Everybody spent 9 years imagining Robert's last violent moments, reconstructing what those dangerous men might have done to him, wondering if he screamed, wondering if he was scared, wondering if he suffered. 9 years of the worst possible mental images running on loop in his wife's head. And none of it happened. He wasn't murdered on July 29th, 2013. He was alive. He was in New York. He was, presumably, fine, physically at least. He lived another 9 years past the day his family started mourning him. He tasted food, he heard music, he watched the seasons change, he fixed people's plumbing. He put his head on a pillow in an unfamiliar bed thousands of nights in a row and kept doing it. He just never picked up the phone. And the case, legally, closed the second police confirmed it was him. Because in America, adults are allowed to walk away from their own lives. It is not a crime. It is not fraud. It is not abandonment in any prosecutable sense. Robert Hoagland committed no offense against the state. He only committed offenses against the people who loved him. Here's my final haunting takeaway for you. Robert's family got the worst possible ending. Not the ending where they find out he was murdered. Not the ending where they find out he ran off with a lover. Not the ending where he comes back through the front door alive and hugs everybody. They got the ending where the man they loved chose, actively and repeatedly, every day for 9 years, not to come home. And then died 3 hours away, still wearing his wedding ring. That's not a resolution. That's not closure. That's an ongoing wound with an answer that only makes the wound worse. Somewhere in Newtown, Connecticut, Lori Hoagland now knows what happened to her husband. And in some ways, that knowledge is harder to carry than the not knowing was. Because it means her Robert was alive all those Christmases, all those birthdays, all those anniversaries, and he had a choice. And every single time, he chose Richard King. Imagine you're a deputy sheriff in Key Largo, Florida. It's May 2013. Beautiful day. You're at your desk, doing paperwork. The bell over the door jingles, and in walks a woman, weathered, sunburnt, skinny in the way homeless people get skinny. She looks like she hasn't slept indoors in years. She walks up to the counter, sits down across from you, and says 4 words that stop your whole afternoon. I'm a missing person. You sort of laugh at first because people don't usually announce that. But she's not joking. She hands over the name, Brenda Heist, from Pennsylvania. And when you run it through the database, the file that comes back is 11 years old, marked presumed deceased, and includes a note that this woman was legally declared dead by a Pennsylvania court back in 2010. She's not dead. She's sitting right in front of you. She's tired. She's done running. She's asking to go home. Except the family she left behind, the husband, the 2 kids she abandoned on a random Friday morning without a note, is not going to want her back. Not now, not ever. This is the story of Brenda Heist. The suburban Pennsylvania mom who walked out of her front door on a freezing morning in February 2002 sat on a park bench and cried, and then made a decision so shocking that her own daughter would one day publicly tell her to rot in hell. Let me take you back. February 8th, 2002. Leaditz, Pennsylvania. If you've never been, Leaditz is the kind of American town that looks like it belongs on a Norman Rockwell painting. Little downtown with a chocolate factory and a pretzel bakery, church steeples, kids on bikes in the summer, snow on the sidewalks in the winter. This is Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Amish country. Quiet, wholesome, boring in the way that a good place to raise kids is boring. And on that particular Friday morning at the Heist household, everything looks completely normal. Brenda Heist is 42 years old. She's a mom of two, 12-year-old son, 8-year-old daughter named Morgan. She works as a bookkeeper at a local car dealership. Solid, unglamorous, middle-class stuff. Neighbors will later describe her as devoted, reliable, the kind of mom who shows up. She's the one who volunteers at the school. She's the one who runs the bake sale table. From the outside, Brenda Heist is doing everything right. But behind the front door of this cute little Pennsylvania house, the whole life is quietly cracking. Because Brenda's in the middle of a divorce. It's an amicable one, technically. Her husband Lee isn't the villain in this story. They're separating. And Brenda, at 42, is looking at what her life is going to look like on the other side of that divorce paper, and she is terrified. Absolutely terrified. She needs a place for herself and the kids. She's been trying to get a modest apartment. She'd applied for state housing assistance to help make it work. And the day before she vanished, she found out she'd been denied. That's the invisible pressure cooker. On the surface, everything is calm. Under the surface, Brenda's brain is running the same panicked math over and over. How do I house my kids? How do I afford this? How am I going to do this? She has no idea how she's going to do it. And on the morning of February 8th, 2002, that pressure cooker finally cracks. At 7:30 a.m., Brenda does the routine. She wakes the kids, she gets them dressed, she drives them to school, drops them off, waves goodbye. Totally normal, totally in character. Then she goes home. And here's where the story gets weird. Because if you had told me Brenda got home, packed a suitcase, cleaned out the bank account, and drove off, I'd say, okay, this woman had a plan. But that's not what she did. She started a load of laundry. She took a piece of meat out of the freezer and set it on the counter to thaw for dinner that night. Think about that. She set out dinner for a family she was about to abandon, and then she left the house and drove to a local park. She got out of her car, she sat down on a park bench, and she started crying. That's when 3 homeless people wandered up to her, 2 men and a woman, hitchhikers, just passing through. They asked her if she was okay, and somehow, through whatever conversation happened on that bench, they told her they were heading south, down the highway, down toward Florida. And Brenda, 42-year-old suburban bookkeeper, mother of 2, looked at these 3 strangers and said the words that ended her entire life. "Can I come?" She left her car in the parking lot. She got in with them. She hit the road. And by mid-afternoon, when Brenda didn't show up to pick her kids up from school, the entire Heist household exploded into panic. That's when the manhunt began. Police found her abandoned car. They found the laundry running. They found the meat defrosting on the counter, and every single clue pointed the same direction. This was not a woman who planned to leave. This looked like an abduction. Or worse. And because this looked like foul play, the police did what police always do. They started looking at the husband. Lee Heist got destroyed. Systematically. Detectives interrogated him, neighbors whispered, co-workers avoided him, parents at the school pulled their kids away from the Heist children on the playground because they thought Lee was a killer. He lost jobs, he lost friends, he lost, in every way that matters, his standing in that community. And he had to raise those 2 kids, a 12-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl, under the crushing weight of an unproven murder allegation that would just not go away. Meanwhile, Brenda was surviving. Barely. She rode down I-95 with those 3 strangers, ended up in Florida, and started living on the streets. She slept under bridges. She ate discarded food out of dumpsters. She cleaned boats for cash. She lived in a tent city. Eventually, she moved into a camper in Key West with a guy she met. She used different names, Kelsey, Lovey, whatever kept her invisible. And for 11 straight years, she did not once, call her kids, or check the news, or even Google her own name. 8 years into the disappearance, in 2010, Lee finally gave up. He went to court and had Brenda legally declared dead. He collected on her life insurance policy. He tried to give the kids some closure, and then in April 2013, Brenda got tired. She'd been living rough for 11 years, and she had outstanding warrants in Florida from using a fake ID at a traffic stop. She was done running. She walked into that Key Largo police station, sat down, and said the words, "I'm a missing person." Okay, hold on. Let's break down the psychology of this, because this case has some of the most bizarre logic gaps I've ever seen. Start with the morning she disappeared, because the choreography that morning genuinely does not make sense. Let's talk about the defrosting dinner. If you are planning to abandon your family forever, you don't set out dinner. You just don't. That is not a thing a departing person does. Defrosting meat is the most mundane, midweek, see you when I get home behavior a mother can perform. Same with the laundry. You don't start a load of laundry before you disappear forever. Laundry is a promise. Laundry says I will be back in about 45 minutes to move this to the dryer. So which is it? Was Brenda a calculated sociopath who was already thinking about the investigation, methodically staging her home to make it look like she'd been snatched? Was she deliberately buying her family a false sense of security so nobody would notice she was gone until it was way too late? Or was it worse than that? Did her brain literally snap between putting the meat on the counter and getting into her car? Because if you buy her later interviews, that's what she claims. She says she genuinely had no plan. She didn't even know she was going to leave until 3 homeless strangers offered her a way out. She just walked into that park, sat on that bench, and something inside her broke. I don't know which of those is scarier, honestly. The idea of a mother methodically staging a fake kidnapping, or the idea that any of us, could be one really bad Thursday away from doing the exact same thing. Now, let's break down the sheer logistics of her disappearance, because this is what really makes your brain twist. Brenda didn't buy a plane ticket. She didn't have a passport ready. She didn't have an offshore account. She didn't have a burner phone. She didn't have a lover with a boat waiting to spirit her off to Cuba. She had absolutely nothing. Her entire escape plan was get in a van with 3 homeless strangers. That's it. That's the plan. 3 people whose names she didn't know 20 minutes earlier, driving to a state she'd never planned to go to. And here's the crazy part. That turned out to be the perfect escape. Because there is no paper trail on a woman who joins the transient underclass. She wasn't renting apartments in her name. She wasn't opening credit cards. She wasn't filing taxes. She was living entirely off the grid in a country that has millions of people living entirely off the grid. And once you're in that world, you're basically invisible. The 11-year manhunt turned up nothing. And that's not because the police were incompetent. It's because you can't find someone who is sleeping under a different bridge every night, eating out of a different dumpster every day, and answering to a different name every week. The suburban PTA mom vanished into America's homeless population, and the American homeless population absorbed her like water into a sponge. And now, let's talk about the third and darkest piece of this, the collateral damage. Because Brenda didn't just walk away from her own life, she actively torched the lives of everyone she left behind. By walking off that morning, she essentially framed her husband, Lee, for her murder. Not directly. She didn't plant evidence, she didn't leave a note pointing at him, but she left a defrosting piece of meat and a load of laundry and a car in a bus station parking lot, and that combination of clues made it look, to every rational investigator, like she'd been taken. And when a mom is taken, the first, second, and third suspect is always the husband. She let Lee live under that shadow for 11 years. She let her son and her daughter grow up in a house where dad was being whispered about. She let community members treat her kids like plague victims. She let Morgan grow up believing her mother was dead, and possibly at her father's hands. Meanwhile, Brenda was in Key Largo, watching sunsets, cleaning boats, living a hard life, sure, but a life. She was making her choice, day after day, to keep making that choice. Every morning for 4,000 mornings in a row, she woke up and decided again not to call her kids. That's not a moment of madness. That's not a snap. That's a decision, made every single day for 11 years. So what actually happened to Brenda Heist? Nothing happened to her. There was no killer. There was no abductor. There was no conspiracy. The scariest, ugliest truth is that Brenda Heist was a fully functional, well-loved suburban mom who, on one specific freezing Friday in February 2002, decided that being homeless in Florida under a fake name for the rest of her life was easier than being Brenda Heist for one more day. That's it. That's the mystery. That's the answer. When she resurfaced in 2013, there was no fairy tale reunion. There was no tearful embrace. There was no Hallmark movie ending where the family gathered around and forgave her, because the important thing is she's home now. Lee Heist, the man she'd left holding the bag for 11 years, said flatly on camera that he did not want to see her. He said he might try to forgive her someday, but that was for his own peace of mind, not for hers. Morgan, the 8-year-old daughter who'd waited at school pickup that Friday afternoon in 2002 for a mother who was never coming, was 19 by the time Brenda came back. She was a college sophomore, and she went on national television and said, publicly, that she did not want to see her mother. And on Twitter, in a post that got picked up by every news outlet in the country, she used the words, "rot in hell." That is what Brenda Heist came back to. That was the reunion. Not a hug, not a homecoming. A daughter on the internet telling the whole world she wished her mother would rot in hell. And Brenda didn't even get to walk out of that police station a free woman, because remember those outstanding warrants she was tired of running from? She got processed into the Santa Rosa County Jail. She served time. She came out to a family that would not open the door. Here's my final haunting takeaway for you. We love true crime because it's supposed to be about monsters. Killers hiding in the woods, kidnappers in white gloves, strangers with knives, bad guys we can point at and say, there, that's the danger. Don't get near that. Brenda's case is scarier than any of that because there's no monster in the woods. The monster in this story is the crushing, invisible weight of a life you didn't know how to live anymore. A denied housing application, a divorce you didn't want, a future you couldn't picture, a morning when the kitchen just felt too heavy. Millions of people carry that weight every single day. Most of them defrost the meat. They fold the laundry, they pick up the kids, they keep going. Brenda didn't. Brenda got in a van with 3 strangers and vanished for 11 years. And somewhere in Pennsylvania right now, there's a grown woman named Morgan who is old enough to have her own family. And she still doesn't know why her mother chose that. And she probably never will, because Brenda didn't come back with an answer. She just came back tired. Imagine you're a social worker in a small Ontario city. It's a normal Thursday afternoon in January 2016. You've got a full caseload, and one of your clients, a quiet, 50-year-old man you've known for years, sits down across from you and says something strange. He says he's been having flashes, weird little memories that don't quite fit into the life he thinks he's been living. He rubs his forehead. He looks at you, and he says very quietly, "I think my name is Edgar Latulip." Now, that name means nothing to you. It doesn't ring a single bell, but something in the way he says it, that quiet certainty under all the confusion, it makes you pull out your laptop. You open Google, you type in those 2 words, Edgar Latulip, and the internet gives you back a Canadian missing persons poster from 1986, 30 years old. A 21-year-old man with developmental delays, vanished without a trace. His grieving mother has spent 3 decades believing he took his own life at Niagara Falls. You look up from your screen. You look at the man sitting across from you, and you realize the impossible. He's been sitting in front of you for years. This is the story of a Canadian man who forgot his own name for 30 years, and how he cracked his own cold case with a memory flash and a Google search. Let me take you back. September 2nd, 1986, Kitchener, Ontario. If you're not Canadian, Kitchener is a mid-sized city about an hour west of Toronto, a working-class place, historically German, with cold winters and quiet streets. Early September in Ontario has this specific vibe. The days are still warm, but there's a bite to the mornings. Kids are heading back to school. Summer is loosening its grip. There's this feeling in the air that everything's about to change. Inside a specialized residential group home somewhere in that city, a young man named Edgar Latulip is living a heavily supervised, tightly scheduled life. Edgar is 21 years old. On paper, that makes him an adult. In reality, developmentally, he functions at about the level of a 12-year-old. His brain works differently. He needs help with things most adults take for granted: managing money, remembering appointments, taking his medication on time. And the medication matters, because Edgar has psychiatric needs on top of his developmental delays. His mental state is fragile, he's been struggling, and most heartbreakingly, he had recently been experiencing a severe mental health crisis. Think about what that means for the people around him. His mother, Sylvia Wilson, is basically living on the edge of a nervous breakdown at all times. Her son is a grown man in a body she can't protect. She's placed him in this group home because she believed it was the safest place he could be, with routines, with supervision, with trained staff, with locked medicine cabinets and eyes on him around the clock. And on that early September day, all of that safety net fails at once. Because Edgar walks out, he doesn't take his suitcase, he doesn't take his coat, and most critically, he doesn't take his medication. The pills that keep the darkness in his head at bay, he leaves them right there on the shelf. And he walks straight out the door of that group home and into the September air, and the machinery of Canadian bureaucracy stops being able to track him. Police piece together his general trail pretty quickly. He walks to the old Voyager bus terminal. He gets on a bus. Somewhere in southern Ontario, that bus is heading east, toward the Niagara Peninsula, toward the tourist towns, toward the falls. And police, knowing what they know about Edgar, recent suicide attempt, cognitive delays, no medication, no support system, boarding a bus alone, arrive at the darkest possible conclusion. They feared Edgar had fled to Niagara Falls during his mental health crisis. That's an official theory. His mother, in her worst nightmares, comes to accept it too. Because what else is she supposed to think? Her vulnerable, medicated, deeply distressed son disappeared without a coat and headed straight for the falls, a tragically common location for people in deep distress. And then the trail just stops. There's no body, there's no confirmed sighting, there's no security footage from a hotel or a store, there's nothing. Just an empty bus terminal and a sick feeling in his mother's stomach that will not go away for the next 30 years. Sylvia moves on with her life the way parents of missing children move on, which is to say, she doesn't, not really. She relocates to Ottawa eventually, but she never truly closes the book on Edgar. Some part of her can't, because there was never a body, there was never a funeral. There was never that final awful piece of paper that says, "This happened, it's over." Instead, there's this constant open wound. Meanwhile, roughly 75 miles down the highway in the town of St. Catharines, something is happening to Edgar that will define the next 3 decades of his life. Shortly after arriving in the Niagara region, Edgar slips and falls. Hard. He hits his head, hits it badly enough that whatever fragile machinery in his brain was still holding onto his identity, his name, his mother, his group home, Kitchener, all of it just shuts off. He wakes up not knowing who he is. And here's where the story enters territory that sounds like it was written by a bad screenwriter. Because Edgar doesn't just lose a few memories. He loses everything. Complete global amnesia. He doesn't know his name. He doesn't know his age. He doesn't know he has a mother crying for him just a couple of hours away. Somehow, and we'll get to the how in a second, the Canadian system absorbs him. He gets a new name. He gets a new life. He becomes a citizen of St. Catharines with a fresh identity, no past, and no idea he's even missing. For 30 years, Edgar Latulip lived 75 miles from his own missing persons poster. 3 decades. Then, in January 2016, the flashes start, little pieces of memory pushing up through the fog. A word, a face, a name, Edgar Latulip. He tells his social worker. The social worker types those 2 words into Google, and a 30-year-old cold case snaps shut with a click. A voluntary DNA test confirms it. In February 2016, the Niagara Regional Police announced to the world what nobody thought was possible. Edgar Latulip, presumed dead since 1986, has been alive the whole time. He has solved his own disappearance. Okay, hold on. Let's break down why nothing about this case makes sense. Let's start with the amnesia. Because I'm going to be honest with you, real doctors will tell you that Hollywood amnesia is basically fiction. The idea that you can bonk your head, forget your entire life, adopt a new identity, and live as a completely different person for decades. That's Jason Bourne. That's soap operas. That's not real neurology. In real life, most head injuries that cause memory loss cause it for hours or days, not for 30 years. So what happened to Edgar? The specialist's best guess is that his amnesia was so total and so long-lasting because his brain was already vulnerable. He had developmental delays. He was under massive psychological stress. He was suicidal. He was off his medication. His nervous system was essentially running on fumes. And then physical trauma got layered on top of all of that. A hard fall, a head injury. And his brain, lacking the coping mechanisms a fully functioning adult brain would have, just hit the reset button. Not on the trauma, on the entire self. That's the theory, at least. It's rare. It's astronomically rare. It's the kind of thing you'd read in a medical journal and go, yeah, one case in a generation. And Edgar was that one case. But that's the medical logic gap. There's a much bigger bureaucratic logic gap. Because think about this. In 1986, a developmentally delayed adult with a serious head injury shows up somewhere in the Niagara region. He can't tell anyone his name. He has no wallet, no ID, no family listed. He's a walking John Doe. And the Kitchener missing persons case is huge in Ontario at this exact moment. Headlines, posters, a mother begging police to search. How do those two things not connect? Somebody, somewhere, treated Edgar. Somebody must have processed him. Somebody had to give him a bed, a bowl of food, a doctor, a next step. Canada in 1986 wasn't a lawless frontier. Vulnerable adults with head injuries don't just wander unchecked. So why does no one at the hospital, no one at social services, no one at the police station he was inevitably taken to? Why does none of them go, there's a missing 21-year-old developmentally delayed guy from Kitchener. Let me check if this is him. The answer is grim. He fell through the cracks. Different jurisdictions, different agencies, no shared databases, no internet, no facial recognition. In 1986, if the Niagara file and the Kitchener file weren't physically compared by a specific human being sitting at a specific desk, and clearly they weren't, those two cases lived on completely separate planets. And here's where it gets really wild. Somewhere in that gap, the Canadian government issued Edgar a new legal identity. He got a new name, presumably a new social insurance number, access to healthcare, housing, welfare, whatever safety net picked him up. He built a whole life on top of a completely fictional identity that the government itself created. Just to be clear, the government helped an amnesiac, vulnerable adult stay missing from another government agency for 30 years. And here's the part that will break your brain. For 30 years, nobody solved this case. Not detectives, not the FBI, not Interpol, not psychics, not journalists, not amateur sleuths on Reddit. You know what solved it? A social worker. And Google. Think about that for a second. 3 decades of professional police work, cold case reviews, missing persons databases, forensic advances. And the case was ultimately cracked by a client mentioning a name and a social worker typing it into a search bar. Under 5 seconds of effort, 0 investigative training required. And that raises a haunting question, doesn't it? How many other people are out there right now? How many John Does are living quietly in Canadian cities, in American cities, in European cities, with fragments of memory rattling around in their heads that they've never mentioned out loud? How many missing persons cases could be solved by exactly the same lucky, absurd 5-second Google search? Because if it happened once, statistically, it's probably happening again. Right now. Somewhere. So what actually happened to Edgar Latulip? Nobody did anything to him. There was no crime. There was no killer. There was no cult. no cartel, no conspiracy. What happened to Edgar was a fall, a slip, a bump, a tragedy so mundane that it almost feels insulting given the scale of what it cost him. 30 years of a mother's life, 30 years of birthdays, 30 years of the specific torture of not knowing. And now that Edgar has been found, the reunion is bittersweet in a way that's hard to talk about. Because Sylvia Wilson got her son back, but not really. The Edgar she knew, that 21-year-old with the shy smile and the daily medication, that Edgar has effectively been dead for 30 years. Erased. What she got back is a 50-year-old man who has spent his entire adult life being someone else, living somewhere else, loving people she doesn't know, building memories she was never in. He didn't run from her. He never chose to leave her. He was trapped inside his own broken head, unable to find his way home, unable to even know there was a home to find. He wasn't hiding. He was just lost, in the deepest, most literal sense of that word. And the geography of it is what really twists the knife. He wasn't in another country. He wasn't across an ocean. He wasn't in a compound somewhere. He was a 2-hour drive from his mother's front door for 30 years, every single day. Somewhere in St. Catharines, Edgar was making coffee, going to appointments, watching TV, and somewhere in Ontario, then Ottawa, his mother was lighting candles for a son she believed she had lost at Niagara Falls. They were breathing the same Canadian air the whole time. Lucia Dion, the woman who runs a Canadian missing adults database, said afterward that in her entire career, she had never seen a case like this. A person solving their own disappearance after 3 decades of amnesia. It just doesn't happen. Except that one time, it did. And here's my final haunting takeaway for you. Edgar's case is not really a story about a missing man. It's a story about how thin the line is between the person you are and the person you could accidentally become. One fall, one head injury, one perfectly timed neurological reset, and the entire biography of you could go dark. You could wake up tomorrow with a new name in a new town. You could live 30 years as somebody else and never know it and never miss it. Somewhere in your brain, right now, there's a filing cabinet that holds you. Your name, your mom's face, your favorite song, the way you take your coffee. It's all in there, and it's held in place by a system so fragile that a bad fall can burn the whole cabinet down. Edgar's cabinet burned down for 30 years, and by pure, dumb, miraculous luck, one fragment survived. Just his name, just 2 words, and 2 words were enough to bring him home.